Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Walter Blackstone, but everyone calls me Walt. I've been a park ranger for 22 years, and I've spent most of that time alone in places where normal people would never go. The Katmai Wilderness in Alaska is my beat, 80 miles from the nearest town, where the only sounds are wind, water, and whatever's moving through the brush. I liked it that way. After Helen died in that car crash 3 years ago, I couldn't stand being around people anymore. Their sorry faces, their careful words, the way they looked at me like I might break. Out here, nobody looked at me like anything. Out here, I was just another piece of the landscape. July 1963 was supposed to be a routine summer patrol. 2 weeks alone around Naknek Lake, checking campsites, counting bears, making sure the wilderness stayed wild. I'd done this same route dozens of times. I knew every trail, every stream crossing, every place where the fog rolled in thick from the glacial waters. I trusted my ears, above all else, in the wilderness. 22 years of experience had taught me that sound travels differently out here. Bounces off water, gets swallowed by trees, plays tricks in the valleys. But I could tell the difference between a snapping branch and a breaking antler, between wind through leaves and something breathing in the bushes. My ears had kept me alive through bear encounters, river crossings, and storms that came out of nowhere. That's why what happened next scared me so much. On day 12 of my patrol, I was setting up camp near the north shore of Naknek Lake. The fog was rolling in heavy, turning the world gray and quiet. I was pounding tent stakes into the rocky ground when I heard it. "Walt, Walt, help me." I stopped mid-swing and listened. The voice came from across the lake, maybe half a mile away. A woman's voice, calling my name. Scared, desperate, it sounded exactly like Helen. I stood there with the hammer in my hand, feeling cold that had nothing to do with the fog. Helen was dead. I'd buried her myself in the little cemetery outside Anchorage. I'd stood there in the rain, listening to the preacher talk about eternal rest while they lowered her casket into the ground. "Walt, please." There it was again. Same voice, same tone she used when she was really frightened, like the time she'd gotten turned around hiking near our cabin and called for me until I found her sitting on a log, crying. But Helen was dead. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the far shore. Nothing but gray fog and black trees. No flash of color, no movement, no sign of another human being. The voice had to be coming from somewhere else, maybe an echo bouncing off the water weird, maybe some other camper with a voice that just happened to sound familiar. "Hello," I shouted across the lake. "Where are you?" Silence. Not even an echo came back. I finished setting up camp as the fog got thicker. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen, but the voice didn't come again. By the time I got my small fire going, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Isolation does things to your head sometimes. Grief does things too. I made myself some coffee and pulled out my logbook to write up the day's notes. Standard procedure, weather conditions, wildlife sightings, trail status. I dated the entry July 15th, 1963, and started writing, Day 12 of summer patrol. Dense fog rolling in from glacial sources. Trail conditions good. Bear sign frequent but no direct contact. Something's been calling my name, but I'm alone out here. I stopped writing and looked at that last sentence. I hadn't meant to write it. It just came out of my pen, like my hand knew something my brain didn't want to admit. I was about to cross it out when I heard my name again. This time, it wasn't Helen's voice. It was mine. "Walt Blackstone?" The voice came from behind me, from the thick line of alder bushes that separated my camp from the interior forest. It sounded exactly like my own voice, same tone, same accent, even the way I said my own name when I was introducing myself to someone new. I spun around, nearly knocking over my coffee cup. "Who's there?" No answer. The fog had gotten so thick I couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. The alders were just gray shapes, like ghosts of trees. "I know someone's there," I called out. "This is a restricted patrol area. Identify yourself." Still nothing, but I could feel eyes on me. You know that feeling, like when you're being watched by something you can't see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I reached for my flashlight, even though it was still daylight. The beam cut through the fog in a weak yellow cone, showing me tree trunks and undergrowth and nothing else. No footprints in the soft dirt. No broken branches where someone might have pushed through. But I'd heard my own voice calling my own name. That wasn't imagination. That wasn't grief. That was real. I spent the next hour walking the perimeter of my camp, looking for any sign of another person. The nearest trail was 3 miles away, and it would take serious wilderness experience to find my location without following the established routes. Most tourists never got within 50 miles of where I was camped. As the evening wore on, the fog got worse. It rolled off the lake in thick waves, turning everything into gray shadows. I built up my fire bigger than usual and kept my rifle close. Not that I expected trouble from people. In 22 years, I'd never had a problem with violent hikers. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. I was heating up a can of beans for dinner when I heard Helen again. "Walt, I'm lost. I can't find my way back to camp." This time, the voice came from my left, maybe 100 yards into the forest. Clearer than before, like she was calling through a break in the fog. My heart started pounding. I knew Helen was dead. I knew it like I knew my own name, but that voice, it was perfect. Every inflection, every little catch in her throat when she was scared. Even the way she pronounced Walt like it had 2 syllables, Walter, when she was upset. "Helen?" I called back before I could stop myself. "Over here, I can see your fire." Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the voice. The fog was so thick I had to feel my way from tree to tree, following the sound of her calling my name. Behind me, my campfire became just a faint orange glow, then disappeared completely. "Keep calling," I shouted. "I'm coming. I'm by the big fallen log, the one that looks like a bridge." I knew exactly what she meant. About 200 yards from my camp, there was a massive spruce that had come down in a storm, its trunk spanning a small ravine like a natural bridge. Helen and I had found it years ago when we hiked this area together. Before we were married, when she still thought camping was romantic instead of just cold and uncomfortable. But Helen had never been to this specific camp. We'd hiked the main Katmai trails, not this remote backcountry area. She wouldn't know about any fallen logs here. I stopped walking and really listened to what I was hearing. "Walt? Where are you? I'm scared." The voice was coming from ahead of me, but something was off about it. It sounded like Helen, but it was too clear. Sound doesn't carry that well through thick fog. And there was something else, an echo that didn't belong, like the voice was bouncing off something hard. I turned around and started walking back toward my fire. Fast. "Walt, don't leave me. Please don't leave me alone." The voice followed me, getting louder, more desperate. But now I could hear what was wrong with it. It wasn't coming from one place anymore. It was coming from all around me, like Helen was. Walking in a circle around my position, calling from different points. That's when I started running. I crashed through the undergrowth, following my flashlight beam back toward the orange glow of my campfire. Behind me, Helen's voice kept calling, but now it was multiplying. 2 voices, then 3, all saying the same words but slightly out of sync. "Walt, I'm lost. Walt, help me. Walt, don't leave me." I burst into my camp and spun around, shining my light into the fog. The voices stopped instantly, like someone had turned off a radio. I stood there for 10 minutes, breathing hard, listening to nothing but my own heartbeat and the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. When I finally convinced myself to move, I wrote another entry in my logbook. Asterisk. Hearing voices. Familiar voices, maybe experiencing isolation-induced auditory hallucinations. Recommend psychological evaluation upon return to headquarters. Asterisk. But even as I wrote it, I didn't believe it. Those voices weren't hallucinations. They were something else. Something that knew exactly how to sound like the people I'd lost. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear something moving outside my tent. Footsteps circling my camp. the soft whisper of fabric against fabric, like someone brushing past the tent walls. Once, I could have sworn I heard breathing right next to my head, separated from me by just a thin layer of canvas. When morning came, the fog was still thick, but I needed to check something. I walked the entire perimeter of my camp, looking for footprints. What I found made my blood run cold. There were prints, all right, my own boot prints, in the soft dirt around my tent. But they formed a perfect circle, like someone wearing my exact boots had walked around and around my tent all night long. The problem was, I'd never walked in that pattern. I'd only left my tent twice, once to check the fire, once to relieve myself near the tree line. These prints showed someone had circled my tent at least 20 times. I knelt down and studied the tracks more carefully. They were perfect copies of my boot tread, down to the little chip in the right heel where I'd kicked a rock last month. The depth was right for someone my weight. The stride length matched mine exactly, but I hadn't made those tracks. I grabbed my camera and took pictures of the prints, then measured them against my own foot. Identical. Whatever had made these tracks was wearing boots exactly like mine and walking exactly like me. Over the next 3 days, things got worse. I'd hear my own voice calling from the forest, having conversations with people who weren't there. I'd catch glimpses of someone moving through the trees wearing my same green Park Service uniform. Once, I could have sworn I saw myself standing on the far shore of the lake, watching my camp through binoculars. The worst part was the conversations. On the morning of day 15, I was breaking camp to move to my next patrol point when I heard voices coming from about 50 yards away. 2 people having a conversation in the fog. I grabbed my binoculars and crept toward the sound. What I heard made me question my own sanity. It was my voice and Helen's voice, talking like we were both alive and together. "Do you think Walt's okay out here by himself?" Helen's voice asked. "He's tougher than he looks," my voice replied. 22 years in the wilderness. He knows how to take care of himself. I worry about him since the accident. He blames himself, you know. Yeah, I know. But he'll figure it out. Walt always figures things out. I was listening to myself and my dead wife discuss me like I wasn't there. Like I was someone else entirely. The conversation went on for 10 minutes, covering details about my life that no one else could possibly know. My childhood in Montana, the scar on my leg from falling off a horse when I was 12, the way I always checked my gear 3 times before heading into the backcountry. But the voices were wrong in small ways. My voice was too confident, too sure of itself. Helen's voice was too calm. She'd always been nervous in the wilderness, always worried about getting lost or hurt. And they talked about me like they were observing me from a distance, not like they were part of my life. When the conversation finally stopped, I crept forward to where the voices had been coming from. I found a small clearing in the alders, and in the center of the clearing, 2 sets of footprints. One set was Helen's size and pattern, the hiking boots she'd been wearing when she died. The other set was mine, but I'd never been in that clearing, and Helen had been dead for 3 years. That night, I tried to radio for help. My emergency radio could sometimes pick up signals from the ranger station 80 miles away, but I needed clear weather and good atmospheric conditions. Through the static, I managed to get through to my supervisor. "Base, this is Blackstone. I need to report possible psychological disturbance. Requesting early extraction." The reply crackled back through interference. Walt, this is Helen. I'm lost. Can you hear me?" I nearly dropped the radio. Helen's voice was coming through the emergency channel, clear as day. "Base station, do you copy? This is Ranger Blackstone, requesting immediate assistance. Walt, I'm scared. I can't find my way home." I turned off the radio and threw it across my tent. When I picked it up 10 minutes later, it was dead. No static, no signal, nothing. Like something had burned out all the circuits. I was completely cut off now. No radio, no way to call for help, and something in the wilderness that could perfectly mimic the voices of people I knew. Something that was learning everything about me, watching me, studying how I moved and talked and acted. Something that wanted to become me. On the morning of day 16, I found my own footprints leading away from camp in a direction I'd never walked. The trail led through thick forest for almost a mile, ending at a small pond I'd never seen before. At the edge of the pond, The footprints stopped. And in the mud at the water's edge, I found something that made me understand exactly what I was dealing with. My wallet, my compass, my backup knife, all the gear I kept in my left pocket, arranged in a neat line like someone had carefully taken inventory. But all my gear was still in my pocket. I was looking at perfect copies of my equipment, left by something that had studied me closely enough to replicate not just my appearance and voice, but my possessions too. That's when I realized the thing wasn't just mimicking me, it was practicing to replace me. I ran back to my camp, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The fog seemed thicker now, more alive, like it was reaching for me with gray fingers. When I reached my tent, I grabbed my rifle and loaded it with 5 rounds. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. Humans don't leave perfect copies of other people's gear in the mud. Humans don't circle your tent all night wearing your exact boots. And humans definitely don't have conversations with dead people using stolen voices. I sat in the middle of my camp, rifle across my knees, and tried to think through what I knew. The thing could mimic voices perfectly, mine, Helen's, probably anyone it had heard before. It could copy my appearance well enough to fool someone at a distance. It knew details about my life that only I should know. And it was getting bolder, showing itself more often, leaving more evidence. But there had to be limits. There had to be things it didn't know, couldn't copy, couldn't steal. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming toward my camp from 3 different directions. I spun around, rifle ready, trying to track all 3 sounds at once. 3 figures stepped out of the fog. All of them were me. Same height, same build, same Green Ranger uniform. Same weather-beaten face and graying hair. Even the same way of standing, with one shoulder slightly higher than the other. They moved like me, breathed like me, looked at me with my own brown eyes. The one directly in front of me spoke first. "You look tired, Walt." The voice was perfect. Exactly my voice, down to the slight rasp I'd developed from years of shouting over wind and water. "You should get some rest," said the one on my left. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." "We're worried about you," added the third. "All this stress isn't good for a man your age." I kept the rifle pointed at the center one, but my hands were shaking. Looking at them was like looking in a funhouse mirror, familiar but wrong, real but impossible. "What are you?" I managed to ask. All 3 smiled at once. My smile, but colder than I'd ever felt it. "We're you, Walt," they said in perfect unison. "We're what you could be if you just stopped fighting it. We know everything about you now," the center one continued. "Your childhood in Montana, the way you met Helen at that dance in Billings, how you blamed yourself for the accident even though you weren't even in the car. We know about the nightmares," said the left one. "How you wake up every night wondering if you could have saved her. We know why you came out here," said the right one. "Why you chose isolation over dealing with your pain." They were right about all of it. Every detail, every private moment, every thought I'd never shared with another living soul. But then the center one said something that made me realize they didn't know everything. "We know how much you loved Helen. How you proposed to her under the northern lights on Christmas Eve." Wrong. I'd proposed to Helen on a warm June evening by the lake behind her parents' house. There were fireflies, not northern lights, and it was her birthday, not Christmas. "We know what you whispered to her in the hospital before she died," the left one added. Wrong again. Helen had died instantly in the crash. She'd never made it to any hospital. They could copy my voice, my appearance, my mannerisms, even my memories. But they were mixing up details, filling in gaps with guesses. They knew what I'd told other people about Helen, but they didn't know the private moments, the intimate details I'd never shared with anyone. "You're not me," I said, steadying my rifle. "You don't know what I know." All 3 faces showed confusion. My own expression of confusion turned predatory. "We know enough," the center one said, and all 3 started walking toward me. I fired at the center figure. The bullet passed right through it like it was made of fog, and it kept walking. I worked the bolt and fired again, then again, but the bullets didn't even slow them down. They reached me at the same time, and cold hands that felt exactly like my own hands grabbed my arms. I could smell my own scent on them, soap and sweat and gun oil. Their faces were inches from mine, and looking into my own eyes from the outside was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. "Tell us about your wedding vows," the center one demanded. "Tell us what you promised Helen when you married her." That's when I understood. They needed the details to complete the mimicry. They could copy the outside, but they needed me to give them the inside. The private moments, the secret words, the things that made me who I was. "Tell us," all three said together. "Tell us what you whispered to her on your wedding night." I closed my eyes and thought about Helen. Not the Helen they'd been mimicking, but the real Helen. The way she laughed when she was truly happy, the little scar on her chin from falling off her bike as a kid. The way she hummed off key when she cooked breakfast. "I promised to love her through all the seasons," I said quietly. "Summer's heat, winter's cold, spring's hope, and autumn's sorrow." "Yes," the voices hissed. "What else?" "I promised to be her shelter when the storms came, and her compass when she was lost." More. But those weren't the real words. Those were close, but not exact. The real vows, the ones Helen and I had written privately and spoken to each other alone, were different. More personal, more specific to who we were together. "I promised," I said, opening my eyes and looking straight at the center figure, "to be the man who remembered which side of the bed you preferred to sleep on, and to always leave the porch light on when you were coming home late from your sister's house, and to never, ever laugh when you cried at sad movies, even the really terrible ones." The three figures stepped back, their faces showing confusion again. "And I promised," I continued, standing up straighter, "to love you, even if you never learned to make coffee that didn't taste like motor oil, and to remind you every year that you met me at your cousin's wedding, not at a dance in Billings, and that your middle name was Rose, not Marie, like you told everyone else because you thought it sounded more sophisticated." The figures were backing away now, their forms becoming less solid, more transparent. "And Helen promised me," I said, feeling strength return to my voice, "to love me even when I was stubborn and proud and too scared to admit when I was wrong. She promised to remind me that strength isn't the same as isolation, and that grieving alone doesn't honor the dead." The three figures looked at each other, then back at me. Their faces were shifting now, features blurring, becoming less defined. "Those aren't the words," one of them said, but the voice was uncertain now, less perfect. "Those are exactly the words," I replied. "Our words, private words you can't steal because you're not me, and you never knew her." The figures dissolved back into fog, leaving me alone in my camp with an empty rifle and the knowledge that I'd just saved my own identity by remembering who I really was. The fog lifted the next morning, and I hiked out of the backcountry faster than I'd ever moved through wilderness before. 3 days of hard travel brought me back to the ranger station, where I immediately requested a transfer to desk duty and a psychological evaluation. I told the department psychiatrist about isolation-induced stress and recommended changes to solo patrol protocols. I didn't mention voices or mimics or things that steal identities. Some truths are too dangerous to share, and some experiences are too impossible to believe. But I couldn't forget what I'd learned out there. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't been trying to kill me. It had been trying to become me, to take my life, my memories, my identity, and use them to walk back into the world wearing my face. How many times had it done this before? How many people had vanished in remote places, only to return days later, slightly wrong, slightly off, missing crucial details about their own lives? How many families had welcomed home strangers wearing familiar faces? I took early retirement 6 months later and moved to a small town in Montana where I'd grown up. I told people I was tired of the wilderness, ready for civilization. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of isolated places now, afraid of hearing familiar voices calling from empty forests, afraid of seeing myself watching from distant ridges. Sometimes, even now, I catch glimpses of someone who looks like me standing at the edge of parking lots or walking past windows. Always just at the corner of my vision, always gone when I turn to look directly. I've learned not to react, not to call out, not to acknowledge these sightings in any way. Because I know now that some things hunt by mimicry. They study you, learn you, practice being you, until they're ready to take your place. And the only defense is remembering exactly who you are. Not just the public facts anyone could learn, but the private truths that make you uniquely yourself. I still keep a journal, even in retirement. Every day, I write down one memory that only I would know. The way Helen sang in the shower, the color of my first dog's collar, the exact words my father spoke when he taught me to tie a fishing line. Small, specific, personal details that could never be observed from the outside. Because if that thing ever comes for me again, I want to be ready. I want to remember exactly who Walter Blackstone is, down to the smallest detail. And I want to make sure that when I look in the mirror, the person looking back is really me. Last week, I got a letter from the new ranger assigned to my old patrol area around Naknek Lake. Young guy, enthusiastic about solo wilderness work. He mentioned hearing voices in the fog, familiar voices calling his name from impossible directions. I wrote back immediately, told him to request a different assignment, to never patrol that area alone, to trust his instincts if something felt wrong. I haven't heard back from him yet. I probably never will. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the person who received my letter was really the same person who sent the first one. I wonder if somewhere out there, something wearing a young ranger's face is reading my warning and learning exactly what mistakes to avoid next time. The wilderness is vast and full of things that hunger for human identity. Most people never encounter them, never venture far enough from civilization to attract their attention. But for those who do, the rule is simple. Never trust familiar voices in unfamiliar places. And never, ever forget exactly who you are. Because something out there is always listening, always learning, always practicing to become you. And next time, it might succeed. My name is Rebecca Thornfield, but everyone calls me Becca. I've been a park ranger at Denali for 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. It's March now, and I'm writing this from my new post in Death Valley. Yeah, I know how that sounds, trading Alaska's frozen hell for California's burning one. But after what happened in February, I can't stand the cold anymore. Can't stand a lot of things anymore. I used to be an anthropologist before I became a ranger. Got my PhD studying how native cultures survived in harsh places. That's actually how I ended up in Alaska. I was researching Athabascan survival stories when I fell in love with the wilderness. Met my ex-husband there too, though that's another story. We had twin boys, Jake and Sam, who are 7 now and live with their dad in Anchorage. They're the reason I survived what I'm about to tell you. The Kantishna region of Denali is about as remote as you can get in North America. In 1976, it was even more cut off from civilization. The old mining district had been mostly abandoned since the 1922. Just scattered cabins and rusted equipment left behind when the gold played out. Most people avoided it, especially in winter. I should have too. February hit us hard that year. The kind of cold that makes your breath freeze before it leaves your lungs. -40 for weeks, with winds that could knock you down. I was doing a winter wildlife survey, tracking caribou migration patterns, when the storm hit. It wasn't supposed to be a big one. Weather report called for light snow, maybe 10 inches. I had supplies for a week and knew every shelter cabin in a 50-mile radius. I'd done this kind of work dozens of times, but this storm was different. It came down like the sky was falling, dumping 4 feet in 2 days. The wind howled so loud I couldn't hear my own radio calls. By the 3rd day, I knew I was in trouble. My snowmobile was buried, somewhere under a white mountain, and I was 15 miles from the nearest maintained trail. That's when I remembered the old Mackenzie cabin. The Mackenzie family had been miners back in the day. Their cabin was supposed to be about 3 miles north, built solid enough to last through anything. I'd never actually seen it, but the old-timers said it was still standing. In weather like this, it might be my only chance. I packed what I could carry and started walking. The snow was chest-deep in places, and every step was a fight. My snowshoes helped, but not much. After 2 hours, I was exhausted and starting to worry I'd made a mistake. Then I saw the smoke, a thin gray line rising straight up in the still air. Someone was burning wood in a fireplace, which meant the cabin was occupied. I felt a rush of relief so strong it made me dizzy. I wasn't going to die out here after all. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall spruce trees heavy with snow. It was bigger than I'd expected. 2 stories, with a stone chimney and real glass windows. The kind of place that cost serious money back when it was built. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and I could see warm light in the windows. I knocked on the door, my frozen hands barely able to make a sound on the thick wood. "Hello? Anyone there? I'm a park ranger, and I need help." Footsteps inside, slow and careful. The door opened, and I found myself looking at a man who should have been dead for 50 years. The man standing in the doorway looked like he'd stepped out of a 1,920 seconds photograph. He wore suspenders over a wool shirt, had a thick gray beard, and skin like leather. His eyes were pale blue, almost white, and when he looked at me, I felt like he was seeing something I couldn't understand. "Well now," he said, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in a while. "Been a long time since we had visitors." He stepped back and gestured me inside. Come in, come in." "You look," half froze. The cabin was warm and dim, lit by oil lamps and firelight. It smelled like wood smoke and something else, something old and musty, like clothes that had been stored too long. The furniture was handmade and sturdy, the kind that lasts forever. Everything looked exactly like it would have in the 1,920 seconds. "I'm Samuel Mackenzie," the man said, closing the door behind me. "This is my family's place, Becca Thornfield, park ranger. I got caught in the storm and my radio's dead. I need to contact my station." He nodded slowly. "Storm's been bad, real bad. Haven't seen one like this in, must be 40 years now." That's when I noticed the others. A woman sat in a rocking chair by the fire, knitting something with thick, gray wool. She looked up when I came in and smiled, but her eyes had the same pale, strange quality as Samuel's. 2 children, a boy and a girl, sat on the floor playing with carved wooden toys. They might have been 8 or 9 years old, with the same pale eyes and old-fashioned clothes. "This is my wife, Martha, and our little ones, Peter and Mary," Samuel said. The woman nodded. "Pleased to meet you, dear. You must be cold. Come sit by the fire." I should have been relieved. A family, a warm place to wait out the storm. But something felt wrong. The children hadn't looked up when I came in. They kept playing with their toys, moving them in the same patterns over and over. And the adults? There was something about the way they moved, slow and careful, like they were thinking about every step. "How long have you been living here?" I asked. "Oh, long time," Samuel said. "Since the mine was running, good years those were." "The mine shut down in 1924, I said. Samuel just smiled. "Time moves different out here." Martha stood up from her chair. "You must be hungry. I'll fix you something to eat." She moved toward what I assumed was the kitchen, and that's when I saw her feet. She wasn't wearing shoes, just thick wool socks. But the way she walked, she barely seemed to touch the floor, like she was floating just above it. "Actually, I should try to get word to my station," I said. "Do you have a radio?" "Radio's broke," Samuel said. "Been broke for years. Storm knocked out the phone lines too." I hadn't seen any phone lines, but maybe they were buried under the snow. Martha came back with a bowl of something that steamed in the cold air. It smelled like meat stew, rich and thick. "Here you go, dear. This'll warm you up." I took the bowl and looked down at it. The meat was dark red, almost black, cut in chunks that didn't look like any beef or venison I'd seen. It had a strange smell underneath the spices, sweet and sick, like fruit that had gone bad. "What kind of meat is this?" I asked. Martha and Samuel looked at each other. For just a moment, their faces changed. The polite expressions slipped, and I saw something else underneath. Something hungry. "Just meat," Martha said. "Food's scarce in winter. You eat what you can find." I set the bowl down on the table. "I think I'll wait until my stomach settles. The cold makes me nauseous sometimes." Samuel nodded, but his pale eyes never left my face. "Course, no hurry. You'll be staying with us for a while anyway. Storm like this could last weeks." That's when I really started to worry. I'd been in plenty of bad storms, and they didn't last weeks. A few days, maybe a week at most. And there was something about the way he said it, like he was happy about the idea of me being trapped here. "I should probably try to dig out my snowmobile tomorrow," I said, "once the wind dies down." "Wouldn't bother with that," Samuel said. "Snow's too deep. Besides, you're safe here." fed and warm. What more do you need? The children finally looked up from their toys. They stared at me with those pale, empty eyes, and I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Their lips were stained, dark red, like they'd been drinking something the color of blood. The little girl, Mary, smiled at me. Her teeth were gray. "Are you going to eat with us?" she asked in a voice that sounded much older than it should have. "Every meal's better when you share it," the boy added. I stood up quickly, my chair scraping against the wood floor. "I should check on my gear, make sure nothing got damaged in the storm. I'll help you," Samuel said. But I was already moving toward the door. "No, that's okay, I can manage." I grabbed my pack and headed outside. The cold hit me like a slap, but I welcomed it. Something was very wrong in that cabin. The family, the way they moved, the meat that didn't look right, those children with their old voices and gray teeth. I needed to think, and I needed to get away from them to do it. Behind me, I heard the door close. Then I heard something else, voices talking low and urgent, like they were making plans. I spent that first night in the cabin's small storage shed, wrapped in my sleeping bag with my back against the door. It wasn't warm, but it was better than freezing to death outside. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear footsteps in the snow around the shed. Slow, careful steps that would circle the building and then stop. When morning came, the footsteps were gone, but something else was wrong. The snow around the shed was covered in tracks, not human tracks. Something with long, thin feet that ended in what looked like claws. The tracks led from the main cabin to the shed, circled it several times, then led back. I followed them to the cabin door and knocked. "Morning," Samuel's voice called from inside. "Come in and warm yourself." I opened the door carefully. The family was sitting around the table, eating from bowls like the one Martha had offered me the night before. The smell of that sweet sick meat filled the room. "Sleep well?" Martha asked, not looking up from her bowl. "Fine, thanks. I think I'll try to hike out today. The storm's past." Samuel laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "Storm's not past. This is just the eye. Worst part's still coming." I looked out the window. The sky was clear blue, and the sun was shining on fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds. No storm in sight. Looks clear to me. "Looks can lie," Peter said, his child's voice carrying that strange old tone. "Daddy knows weather. He's lived here forever." "How long exactly?" I asked Samuel. "Since 1919, he said calmly, like that was a perfectly normal answer. That would make him over 100 years old. He looked maybe 60. "Must have good genes in your family," I said. "Good food," Martha said, and the way she said it made my stomach turn. "We eat well here, keep our strength up." I noticed the children weren't eating. They were just stirring their spoons around in their bowls, making patterns in the dark. Liquid. "I'm going to scout the area," I said. "See if I can find the best route out." "Wouldn't recommend that," Samuel said. "Dangerous things in these woods, things that hunt when they're hungry." "I'm armed," I said, touching the pistol on my belt. Samuel's pale eyes fixed on the gun, and he smiled. His teeth looked gray too. "Bullets don't stop everything," he said. I left anyway. I needed to figure out what was going on, and I couldn't do it sitting in that cabin with that family and their wrong smiles. The woods around the clearing were thick with snow-covered spruce and pine. I found what looked like an old trail and started following it, checking for landmarks I could use to navigate. After about an hour, I found something that made me stop cold. Another cabin, smaller than the Mackenzie's place. The door was hanging open, and something had torn it off its hinges from the inside. I approached carefully, my hand on my gun. Inside was a mess. Furniture overturned, windows broken, dark stains on the wooden walls and floor. In the corner was a pile of bones, human bones, from the look of them. They'd been cracked open, and the marrow was gone. On the table was a journal, its pages yellow with age. The last entry was dated February 15th, 1924. Asterisk, "The hunger's getting worse. Haven't eaten real food in days." Johnson's been eyeing little Mary, strange-like, and I caught Samuel looking at Martha the same way. "God help us. I think I know what they're planning." Asterisk, asterisk, "If anyone finds this, stay away from the mine. Something happened down there. Something changed us. We can't stop thinking about meat, about feeding, and the cold don't bother us anymore. Asterisk, asterisk, we ain't human no more. Asterisk, the journal went on, describing how the mining team had found something in the deepest shaft. Something old and hungry that had been sleeping in the permafrost. They'd brought it up without knowing what it was, and it had infected them somehow. The final entry was just one line. Asterisk, they're coming for me now. Asterisk. I dropped the journal and backed out of the cabin. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. The Mackenzies weren't just strange, they were the miners from 1924. Somehow, they were still alive, still here, and they weren't human anymore. I started running back toward the main cabin, crashing through the snow. I needed my gear, needed to get out of here before they realized I knew the truth. But when I reached the clearing, they were waiting for me. All four of them stood in the snow outside their cabin, perfectly still. They didn't look cold, even though they were dressed for the 1920 seconds, not for -40 weather. Martha was smiling her horrible smile. Find what you were looking for? Samuel asked. I know what you are, I said, pulling out my pistol. Do you now? Martha said. And what's that? You're the miners from 1924. You found something in the mine shaft, and it changed you. Samuel nodded approvingly. Smart girl. Smarter than most who find their way here. Most? Oh yes, Peter said in his old child's voice. We get visitors sometimes, when they're lost, when they're hungry. That's when I realized the truth. They didn't just eat human flesh, they turned people into what they were. The journal had talked about the hunger, about how it changed them. And they'd been doing this for 50 years, catching lost hikers and miners and hunters. You're going to let me leave, I said, keeping the gun trained on Samuel. Are we? Mary asked, tilting her head like a curious bird. That's when they moved. I'd never seen anything move that fast. One moment they were standing 10 feet away, the next, they were on me. Samuel knocked the gun from my hand, while Martha grabbed my arms. The children flanked me, moving with impossible speed for their size. Up close, I could see what they really were. Their skin was gray-white, like frost. Their eyes weren't just pale, they were completely colorless, like ice. And their teeth were long and sharp and stained with old blood. Now, Samuel said, his face inches from mine, you're going to come inside, and you're going to eat with us. And after a few meals, you won't want to leave anymore. You'll like it here, Martha added. It's peaceful, quiet, and there's always enough food. They dragged me toward the cabin, and I knew that if they got me inside, I was dead. Or worse, I'd become like them. I broke free just as we reached the cabin door. Maybe they were overconfident, or maybe 50 years of easy hunting had made them sloppy. Either way, I twisted out of Martha's grip and ran. Behind me, I heard Samuel laugh. Go ahead and run, Becca. We like it when the food exercises first. Makes the meat tender. I crashed through the trees, following what I hoped was the trail back to where I'd left my snowmobile. Branches whipped at my face, and the snow grabbed at my boots. But I kept running. I could hear them behind me, not running, just walking at that same slow, careful pace. They knew these woods better than I did. They knew I couldn't escape. But I had one advantage they didn't know about. Before I became a ranger, before I studied anthropology, I'd grown up in northern Minnesota. My grandfather had been a logger, and he'd taught me things about winter survival that you don't learn in books. I found my buried snowmobile and started digging. It was hard work, and I could hear them getting closer. The machine was covered in 4 feet of snow, but the engine was still good. Grandpa had always said the key to cold weather engines was knowing how to coax them to life when they didn't want to start. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, roaring to life in the quiet forest. I gunned it and took off down what I hoped was the trail, snow flying everywhere. That's when I learned something else about the Mackenzies. They were fast, much faster than any human should be, even running through deep snow. I could see them in my mirrors, keeping pace with the snowmobile like they were jogging instead of sprinting through chest-deep powder. The trail led to an old mining road, and from there I could follow the main route back to the ranger station. But as I reached the road, something stepped out in front of me. It was Samuel, but not the Samuel from the cabin. This was what he really looked like under the human disguise. He was tall, maybe 8 feet, and thin like a skeleton. His skin was white as snow, and his mouth was full of long, needle-sharp teeth. His pale eyes glowed in the dim winter light. I swerved to avoid him and lost control. The snowmobile went down, throwing me into a snowbank. When I looked up, all 4 of them were there, standing in a circle around me. They'd dropped their human appearance completely. Martha was the worst. Her face was stretched long, like a wolf's muzzle, and her fingers had grown into black claws. The children looked like dolls that had been left too long in a freezer, their skin blue-white, their eyes like holes in their heads. "Time to come home," Samuel said, his voice like wind through dead trees. That's when I remembered what I'd found in the ruined cabin. The miner's journal had mentioned something about fire, how the creatures couldn't stand heat. I still had emergency flares in my pack. I pulled one out and lit it, the red light flaring bright in the gray afternoon. The Mackenzies hissed and stepped back. The flare light seemed to hurt them, making their white skins smoke wherever it touched. "Stay back," I shouted, waving the flare. "Fire won't last forever," Martha snarled. "And we have patience. We've waited 50 years. We can wait longer." But I wasn't planning to wait. I had 4 more flares, and about a quarter mile down the road was something I'd noticed on the way in, an old mining shed with propane tanks stacked outside. I started walking backward down the road, keeping the flare between me and the creatures. They followed at a distance, staying just outside the circle of light. They moved wrong now that they weren't pretending to be human, flowing over the snow instead of walking through it. "You can't run forever, Becca," Samuel called. "And when you get tired, when you get hungry enough, you'll want what we're offering." "The hunger's already started, hasn't it?" He was right. I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning, and my stomach was cramping with more than just fear. But it wasn't normal hunger. It was something else, something that made me think about the dark meat in Martha's bowl. The mining shed was old but solid, built to last through Alaskan winters. The propane tanks were newer, probably left by a survey crew in the 1972nd. I backed up to the shed door and lit my second flare. "What are you planning, girl?" Martha asked. "Insurance," I said, and threw the first flare into the shed. The building went up like a torch. Dry wood and old mining chemicals make for a good fire, and within seconds the whole structure was blazing. The Mackenzies shrieked and moved back, but they didn't leave. They just waited at the edge of the firelight, watching. I lit my third flare and used it to heat one of the propane tank valves until the metal expanded enough to start leaking gas. Then I picked up the tank, it was heavy, maybe 40 pounds, and started unscrewing the valve completely. "You'll kill yourself," Samuel warned, but he sounded nervous for the first time. "Maybe," I said, "but I'll take you with me." The gas was hissing out now, invisible but deadly. I could smell it mixing with the smoke from the burning shed. One spark in the wrong place and everything for 100 yards would go up in a fireball. "Last chance," I told them. "Leave me alone, or we all burn." Peter laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "You don't have the courage. Humans never do when it comes to the end. You'll drop that flare and come with us. You'll eat what we give you, and you'll like it." That's when I thought about Jake and Sam, my 7-year-old boys waiting for me in Anchorage. I thought about how they'd never know what happened to their mother if I disappeared in these woods. And I thought about how many other people had died in that cabin over the past 50 years. I pulled the valve completely free. Gas roared out of the tank, and I threw my last 2 flares as far as I could in opposite directions. The explosion lit up the entire forest. I woke up 3 days later in an Anchorage hospital with burns on my arms and no eyebrows. The blast had thrown me clear of the worst of it, and the deep snow had cushioned my landing. Search and rescue had found me half buried and unconscious, with a story about getting caught in a propane explosion that no one questioned too closely. The official report said I'd taken shelter in an abandoned mining building and accidentally triggered a gas leak while trying to stay warm. The explosion destroyed everything in a 50-yard radius, including any evidence of what had really been there. I never mentioned the Mackenzies. Who would believe me? A family of cannibalistic miners from the 1922nd, still alive after 50 years in the frozen wilderness? It sounds crazy even to me, and I lived through it. But I know they didn't all die in that explosion. Something that can survive for decades in the Alaskan wilderness doesn't give up that easily. Sometimes, when the wind is right and I'm walking alone at night, I think I can hear Samuel's voice calling my name, telling me the hunger will come back, telling me I can't run forever. He's right about the hunger. It did come back. Not the same hunger that drove the Mackenzies. I'm still human, still myself, but I can't eat normally anymore. Every meal feels like too much or too little. I count calories obsessively, weigh myself 3 times a day, and sometimes I catch myself staring at raw meat in the grocery store and wondering what it would taste like. My boys worry about me. Jake asked me last week why I don't eat dinner with them anymore. I told him Mommy's on a special diet, but the truth is I can't trust myself around family meals. The smell of cooking meat makes me think of that cabin, that bowl Martha offered me, and the sweet sick odor of something that had been human once. I transferred to Death Valley as soon as the doctors cleared me for duty. Hot, dry, bright, everything Alaska isn't. The other rangers think I'm crazy for choosing the desert, but they don't understand. Cold makes me remember things I don't want to remember. Winter makes me hungry in ways that scare me. The Kantishna mining district is permanently closed to the public now. The official reason is unstable ground from old mining operations, but I know better. I made sure of that. Some things are too dangerous to leave accessible, even by accident. But sometimes I get reports, hikers who went missing in the area, hunters who never came back. The search teams never find anything, of course. Just empty wilderness and old mine shafts that go down too deep to explore safely. I tell myself the Mackenzies are gone, that the explosion finished them. But late at night, when the desert wind sounds like voices calling, I'm not so sure. The hunger that walks like men is patient. It can wait in the cold and the dark for as long as necessary. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I try not to examine too closely, part of me is still waiting too. Still listening for footsteps in the snow. Still wondering what would have happened if I'd just taken one bite. My name is Rebecca Thornfield, and I survived something that shouldn't exist. But survival isn't the same as escape, and some hungers never really die. They just learn to wait. Asterisk. Ranger Thornfield's account was found among her personal effects following her death from complications related to severe malnutrition in 1982. The Kantishna mining district remains closed to public access. My name is Marcus Ironwolf, and I've been a park ranger for 15 years. Most folks think that's a made-up name, but it's what my grandfather called me when I was little. Said I had the spirit of both iron and wolf. Never thought much about it until what happened in September of '81. I work out of Chugach State Park in Alaska, up near Eklutna Lake. It's wild country, the kind where you can hike for days and never see another soul. That's how I like it. After what I saw in Vietnam, crowds make me nervous. Out here with my 3 German shepherds, Rex, Duke, and Bear, I can breathe easy. People always ask how I got into search and rescue. Truth is, after the war, I couldn't sleep much. Had these dreams, you know? So I'd walk the woods at night with the dogs, started finding lost hikers by accident. Turned out I was good at it, real good. The dogs were the secret. Rex could track a 3-day-old trail through rain. Duke could find a person buried under 6 feet of snow. Bear could smell fear from a mile away. In 15 years, we'd brought home over 100 people alive. I trusted those dogs more than I trusted myself. Which is why what happened that September morning shook me so bad. I was drinking coffee in the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. "Base, this is Thompson. We got a problem." Thompson worked the front desk, dealt with permits and such. Nice kid, but green as grass. His voice sounded tight. "Go ahead, Thompson." 3 hunters checked in yesterday morning, said they'd be back by nightfall. Their truck's still in the parking lot. Not unusual. Hunters get excited, lose track of time. They file a route plan? Yeah, heading up the North Fork toward Eagle Peak. But Marcus, their dogs came back. That made me sit up. Hunters don't leave their dogs behind. Ever. Come again? 2 hunting dogs showed up at the trailhead an hour ago. No collars, no owners. They're acting real strange. Won't let anyone near them, won't stop shaking. I looked down at Rex, who was lying by my feet. His ears had perked up, like he could hear something I couldn't. "I'll be right there." 20 minutes later, I was standing in the parking lot looking at 2 of the most scared dogs I'd ever seen. They were good animals, a bloodhound and a retriever mix, but they were acting like they'd seen the devil himself. The bloodhound was pressed against a car tire, whimpering. The retriever kept looking back at the tree line and growling low in his throat. "They been like this the whole time?" I asked Thompson. "Worse when they first showed up." The bloodhound was howling something terrible. Sounded almost human. I knelt down slow, the way you do with spooked animals. "Easy, boy. Easy now." The bloodhound looked at me with eyes that seemed too old for his face. When I reached out, he sniffed my hand, then pressed against my leg like he was begging for protection. That's when I knew something was really wrong. Hunting dogs are tough. They face down bears, track through blizzards, work until their paws bleed. Whatever had scared these two had scared them deep. "Get on the radio," I told Thompson. "Tell headquarters we're launching a search operation. 3 missing persons, last known location North Fork Trail." I loaded my pack with the usual gear, first aid kit, emergency blankets, flares, rope, added some extra supplies since we might be out overnight. The whole time, my 3 dogs watched me with interest. They knew the routine. But when I opened the truck door, something strange happened. Rex, who always jumped in first, hung back. Duke actually took a step away from the truck. Bear started whining. "Come on, boys, we got work to do." Rex looked at me, then at the 2 hunting dogs, then back at me. I swear, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Doubt. It took 10 minutes of coaxing to get them in the truck. Even then, they huddled together in the back, which wasn't like them at all. Usually they'd be excited, tails wagging, ready to work. The drive to the trailhead took 30 minutes on rough forest roads. The whole way, my dogs stayed quiet. No panting, no movement. Just 3 German shepherds staring out the back window like they were watching for something following us. I'd been up the North Fork Trail 100 times. It's a decent hike. Starts easy along the creek, then climbs steep through spruce forest toward the peaks. The hunters had planned to work the high meadows where the elk gather in September. Good hunting country, but dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. At the trailhead, I checked my gear one more time. Radio, GPS, survival kit. My service pistol, though I'd never had to use it on a rescue. The dogs finally seemed to settle down a bit once we were away from those 2 spooked hunting dogs. "All right, boys, let's bring these people home." I started up the trail with Rex in the lead, the way we'd done it 1,000 times before. The morning was crisp, early snow dusting the high peaks. Beautiful country, peaceful. Rex made it maybe 50 yards before he stopped dead. I'd seen him track through mud, snow, rain, and wind. Seen him follow trails so old they were more memory than scent. Never once had I seen Rex stop tracking without finding his target. He stood in the middle of the trail, nose to the ground, but his whole body was rigid. His hackles, the hair along his neck and spine, were standing straight up. Duke and Bear flanked him, showing the same signs. "What is it, boy?" Rex looked up at me, then back at the trail. He took 1 step forward, then immediately stepped back. All 3 dogs were trembling now. I knelt down and looked at the ground myself. Fresh boot prints, definitely from the hunters. A few paw prints from their dogs, nothing unusual. But there was something else. Other tracks, partially covered by fallen leaves, bigger than dog prints, smaller than bear. Strange shape, base. "This is Iron Wolf." I spoke into my radio. "I'm at the trailhead. My dogs are showing unusual behavior. Something's got them spooked." "Copy that, Marcus. You want backup?" I looked at Rex, who was now staring into the forest with every muscle tensed. In 15 years, I'd learned to trust my dog's instincts above everything else. They'd saved my life more than once by sensing danger I couldn't see. But 3 people were missing. Maybe hurt, maybe dying. That's what I kept telling myself, as I made the decision that nearly cost me everything. Negative, base. We're proceeding with the search. I should have turned around right then, should have called for backup, brought more men, more firepower. But I was Marcus Ironwolf, the ranger who never came back empty-handed, the man who trusted his dogs above all else. I had no idea that trust was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. The first mile was the worst. My dogs would take a few steps, stop, sniff the air, then look back at me like they were asking if we really had to keep going. Rex, my lead dog who'd tracked through blizzards and avalanche zones without hesitation, was moving like he was walking through a minefield. The hunter's trail was easy to follow at first, 3 sets of boot prints heading up the creek path. Their dogs had been running ahead, judging by the scattered paw prints on both sides of the trail. Normal hunting party behavior, but then the dogs' prints changed. Instead of ranging wide like hunting dogs do, they started staying close together. Real close. By the time I reached the first creek crossing, all the paw prints were clustered between the boot prints, like the dogs were trying to hide. "Easy, Rex," I said when he stopped again at the creek crossing. The water was shallow, maybe ankle deep, nothing dangerous about it, but Rex acted like it was full of crocodiles. That's when I saw the first sign something was really wrong. On the far side of the creek, pressed into the mud, was a print I couldn't identify. Bigger than a wolf, smaller than a bear, but shaped wrong for either. It had 4 toes like a dog, but they were longer, more like fingers. And there were marks that looked almost like claw marks, but arranged in a pattern that didn't make sense. I took a picture with my camera, then called it in. "Base, I'm finding some unusual tracks. Might be a new predator in the area." "Copy. What kind of tracks?" I stared at the print again. In 15 years of wilderness work, I'd seen every animal that lived in these mountains. This wasn't any of them. Unknown species. I'm documenting and continuing search. Rex finally crossed the creek, but he kept looking back over his shoulder. Duke and Bear stayed so close to me they kept bumping into my legs. The forest around us was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Just the sound of our footsteps on wet leaves. 2 miles in, I found the first camp. The hunters had set up in a good spot, small clearing next to the creek, sheltered by big spruce trees. Their orange tent was still standing, camp stove and gear laid out neat and tidy, but no hunters. "Hello," I called out. "Park Service. Anyone here?" Nothing. I approached the campsite carefully, my dogs pressed against my legs. The tent flap was zipped shut. Inside, I found 3 sleeping bags laid out, personal gear organized in stuff sacks. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing missing that I could see. These guys had just left. But why would hunters abandon a good campsite with all their gear? I was checking their food supplies when I heard Duke growl. Not his usual warning growl. This was different, deeper, scared. I turned around and felt my blood freeze. On the far side of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, something was watching us. It stood upright like a man, but it was too tall, too broad. And when it moved, it didn't move right. Too fluid, too quick. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Rex, who was now pressed so hard against my leg he was nearly knocking me over. All 3 dogs were staring at the same spot where I'd seen the figure, their bodies rigid with fear. I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Base, I'm at the hunter's campsite. Camp is intact, but no sign of the missing persons. I may have visual contact with an unknown individual." "Copy, Marcus. Can you identify?" I stared at the empty forest. Whatever I'd seen was gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it was getting stronger. Negative identification, continuing search. I spent 20 minutes going through the campsite inch by inch. The hunters had eaten dinner, cans and wrappers in their trash bag. They'd cleaned their weapons, gun oil smell still lingered in the tent. They'd planned to hunt the next morning, alarm clock set for 5 a.m., but they never went to bed. The sleeping bags hadn't been slept in. Their hunting clothes were still laid out. Whatever happened, happened after dinner, but before bedtime. I found the trail leading away from camp on the north side of the clearing. 3 sets of boot prints again, but now they were different. Longer strides, like the men were hurrying. Or running. And there were other prints with them. Lots of them. The same strange, not quite dog, not quite human prints I'd found at the creek. They paralleled the hunter's trail on both sides, like something had been hurting them. "Rex, track," I commanded. Rex looked at the trail, then at me, then sat down. He'd never refused a direct command in 8 years of working together. "Rex, track, now." This time he whined and actually backed away from the trail. Duke and Bear flanked him, all 3 dogs now positioned between me and the trail like they were protecting me. I'd seen enough animal behavior to know what this meant. My dogs sensed a predator, something dangerous enough that their training was overridden by pure survival instinct. But I had a job to do. I started following the trail myself, reading the signs the way my grandfather had taught me as a kid. The hunters had definitely been running by the end. Their stride length increased, and there were skid marks where they'd slipped on wet leaves. They'd been heading uphill, toward Eagle Peak. The other prints, the unknown ones, had been keeping pace easily. Sometimes they'd disappear entirely, like whatever made them had jumped from rock to rock. Other times, there would be clusters of them, like multiple animals had gathered to plan their next move. That thought sent chills down my spine. Pack hunters that could plan? A quarter-mile from the camp, I found the first piece of evidence that made my hands shake. Hanging from a spruce branch about 8 feet off the ground was a strip of orange fabric, hunting vest material. It had been placed there deliberately, not torn off by accident. The edges were too clean, too precise. Something had left it as a marker. I was reaching for my camera when I heard the sound that changed everything. A howl. But not from any wolf I'd ever heard. This was deeper, more complex. It had layers to it, like multiple voices howling in harmony. And it was answered, from the north, then the east, then the south. We were surrounded. Rex pressed against my legs so hard he nearly knocked me down. All 3 dogs were shaking now, making small, whimpering sounds. They could hear things I couldn't, smell things beyond my understanding. The howling stopped as suddenly as it started. The forest went dead, quiet again. I keyed my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. Base, be advised. I'm hearing wolf activity in the area. Recommend you contact Fish and Game about possible pack movement. Copy, Marcus. How many wolves are we talking about? I listened to the silence around me, counted the directions the howls had come from, did some quick math that made my mouth go dry. Base. I count at least 6, maybe more. They seemed to be coordinating. That wasn't normal wolf behavior. Wolves hunt in packs, but they don't coordinate ambushes like military units. They don't leave markers for human trackers to find. They don't herd people through the forest. But something was doing all of those things. I was starting to back toward the main trail when I saw them. Just glimpses at first. Dark shapes moving between the trees, staying just out of clear sight. They moved wrong for wolves, too upright, too purposeful, and they were following us. Come on, boys, I whispered to my dogs. Time to go. For the first time since we'd started, Rex seemed eager to move. All 3 dogs positioned themselves around me as we started back down the docks trail, their heads constantly turning, watching the forest on all sides. I'd gone maybe 100 yards when I realized the truth that nearly stopped my heart. The howling hadn't been a warning or a territorial display. It had been a hunting call, and we were the prey. The attack came 2 miles from the hunters' camp, just as the trail started its steep descent toward the creek. I heard Rex growl a split second before the first one stepped out of the trees. It stood on 2 legs like a man, but that's where the similarity ended. 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with shoulders broader than any human. Its face was wrong, too long, too full of teeth. And its eyes, God, its eyes looked right at me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Easy, I said, backing away slowly. Easy now. That's when I heard the rustling from both sides of the trail. We weren't facing one creature, we were facing a pack. They stepped out of the forest like they'd been, waiting for this moment. 6 of them, maybe 7, moving with coordinated precision. They spread out in a semicircle, cutting off any escape route except straight back up the trail. Rex, Duke, and Bear pressed against my legs, growling low in their throats. They were scared, but they were ready to fight. That's the thing about good dogs. They'll stand with you even when they're terrified. The lead creature, the biggest one, tilted its head and made a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a bark, not quite a word, but somehow both. The others responded with similar sounds, like they were talking. That's when I understood what had happened to the hunters. These things didn't just hunt like wolves. They planned like humans. They'd herded the hunters away from their camp, separated them from their dogs, driven them deeper into the wilderness where no one would find them. And now they were doing the same to me. Base, I whispered into my radio, I need immediate backup, at my location. Multiple hostile animals, possibly rabid. Static. I was too deep in the mountains for clear transmission. The pack leader took a step forward. It moved on 2 legs but dropped to 4 when it wanted speed. Its hands, and they were hands, not paws, had claws longer than my fingers. I slowly reached for my service pistol. The .357 revolver felt small and useless in my hand, but it was all I had. The creature saw the gun and made that barkward sound again. The others responded by spreading out further, moving to flank me. They understood weapons. They knew tactics. That's when Rex made his choice. My lead dog, the one who'd tracked for 8 years without failing, suddenly lunged forward at the pack leader. 90 pounds of German Shepherd hit the creature's center mass, driving it back into the trees. The fight that followed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Rex fought like his life depended on it. But the creature was stronger, faster. It grabbed Rex with those clawed hands and threw him against a tree. I heard ribs crack. Rex! I raised my pistol and fired. The bullet took the creature in the shoulder, spinning it around. It roared, a sound that shook snow from the trees, but it didn't go down. The rest of the pack rushed us. Duke and Bear met them head-on while I kept firing. The gunshots echoed through the forest like thunder. I hit 2 more of them, but they kept coming. One of the creatures grabbed Duke and lifted him off the ground. I put a bullet through its head before it could finish him off. But there were too many. A clawed hand raked across my back, tearing through my jacket and shirt. I spun and fired point blank into the creature's chest. It stumbled backward but didn't fall. That's when I realized the terrible truth. These things could be hurt, but they were incredibly hard to kill. Bear was down, bleeding from claw marks across his ribs. Duke was limping but still fighting. Rex was trying to get back on his feet, blood running from his mouth. I was down to my last 2 bullets. The pack leader, the one I'd shot first, was back on its feet. It looked at me with those intelligent eyes and did something that nearly made me drop my gun. It smiled, not a dog's expression of happiness, but a human smile, cold and calculating. Then it whistled, not with its mouth, but with its fingers. A complex series of notes that sounded like military signals. The other creatures immediately backed off, forming a loose circle around us. They weren't retreating, they were regrouping. Smart, I said to myself. Too damn smart. I helped Rex to his feet. All 3 of my dogs were hurt, but they were alive. The creatures had pulled back about 30 feet and were just watching us. Waiting. Base, this is Ironwolf. I tried the radio again. Emergency situation. Under attack by unknown animals. Requesting immediate helicopter extraction. Still static. The time. Pack leader made that barkward sound again, and one of the others disappeared into the forest. Hunting parties use scouts. These things were hunting us like we were enemy soldiers. I had 2 bullets left and 3 injured dogs. The nearest road was 6 miles away, through terrain these creatures knew better than I did. But I'd survived Vietnam by thinking like a soldier, not a victim. All right, boys, I said to my dogs, we're going to fight our way out of here. I pulled an emergency flare from my pack and held it ready. The creatures didn't like the bright light when I cracked it. They backed off another few feet, hissing. Light. They didn't like light. I had 4 more flares. If I could use them to break up their formation, maybe we could make it to open ground. The pack leader seemed to understand what I was thinking. It made another series of whistled signals, and the circle began to tighten. Time to move. I fired my 6th bullet into the air, not at the creatures, but to make noise. The gunshot startled them for just a second. In that moment, I grabbed Rex and ran, not down the trail where they expected, but straight up the steep slope toward the ridge. It was harder terrain, but it was the direction they couldn't surround. Behind me, I heard the pack give chase. Rex, Duke, and Bear ran beside me, despite their injuries. We crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, scrambled up rocks that cut our hands and paws. My lungs burned in the thin mountain air. The creatures were faster on flat ground, but the steep terrain slowed them down. They had to pick their way more carefully on the rocky slope. I could hear them behind us, not just running, but communicating. Those barkward sounds echoing from different directions. They were still coordinating, still hunting as a unit. 50 feet from the ridgeline, I turned and fired my last bullet at the closest creature. It dove for cover behind a boulder, but it bought us the seconds we needed to reach the top. The ridge was open ground, wind-blown rock, with no trees for cover, but it was also where my radio might work. Mayday, mayday, this is Park Ranger Marcus Ironwolf. Emergency extraction needed at Eagle Ridge, under attack by hostile animals. Static, then, Marcus, this is base. What's your situation? Multiple large animals, aggressive behavior. 3 injured working dogs. I'm out of ammunition. Copy. Helicopter en route. ETA 30 minutes. 30 minutes. I looked back down the slope where dark shapes were moving through the trees. The creatures had stopped their direct assault, but they were still there. Waiting. They knew I was trapped on the ridge. They knew I was out of bullets. And they had all the time in the world. Rex pressed against my leg and looked up at me with trust I didn't deserve. I'd led my dogs into this. Now I had to get them out alive. The wind on the ridge was cold and getting colder. Storm clouds were building over the peaks. If the weather closed in, no helicopter could reach us. I checked my watch. 29 minutes to go. That's when I saw the pack leader climbing up the backside of the ridge. It had circled around while the others kept us pinned. Smart. Military smart. I picked up a rock the size of a softball. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all I had left. Come on then, I said. Let's finish this. The pack leader reached the top of the ridge just as the first snowflakes began to fall. It stood silhouetted against the gray sky, no longer bothering to hide what it was. In the open, with nowhere to run, we faced each other like gunslingers in an old western. Except I was out of bullets and staring at something that shouldn't exist. Up close, I could see details that made my hands shake. Its fur wasn't just dark, it had patterns, like war paint. Scars crisscrossed its chest and arms, old wounds that spoke of many fights. This wasn't just a predator, it was a veteran. Rex growled low in his throat and tried to step forward. I put my hand on his head. No, boy. This one's mine. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then it did something that nearly stopped my heart. It looked at my uniform, at my ranger badge, and made a sound that was almost like laughter. It recognized authority. It understood hierarchy. And it was challenging mine. The thing dropped to a crouch, muscles coiled like springs. I could see intelligence in its eyes, not animal cunning, but human-level thinking. It was calculating distance, angles, my strength versus its own. Base, this is Ironwolf, I whispered into my radio. Helicopter status? 25 minutes out, Marcus. Weather's getting bad up there. 25 minutes, might as well be 25 hours. The creature charged. I'd faced human enemies in Vietnam, but nothing like this. It moved faster than any man, hit harder than any animal. We collided in the middle of the ridge, and suddenly I was fighting for my life with my bare hands. Its claws raked across my ribs, tearing through jacket and shirt like paper. I grabbed its wrist and tried to control those deadly hands, but it was stronger than me. Much stronger. It threw me backward across the rocky ground. I rolled and came up with a jagged stone in my hand, swinging it like a club. The rock connected with its skull, drawing black blood, but it barely flinched. Rex, Duke, and Bear circled us, barking and snarling. They wanted to help, but they were smart enough to know this was a duel. Pack leaders settling things the old way. The creature feinted left, then came in low from my right. Its claws caught my thigh, sending fire up my leg. I stumbled backward, blood running down into my boot. But I'd learned something important. It fought with intelligence, but also with patterns. Military training teaches you to recognize enemy tactics. When it charged again, I was ready. Instead of backing up, I stepped forward and inside its reach. My elbow caught it in the throat, and for the first time, it made a sound of pain. We grappled hand to hand on the narrow ridge. Below us, on both sides, was a 100-foot drop into rocky forest. One wrong step would end the fight permanently. The creature was stronger, but I had experience. 20 years of military and rescue work had taught me how to fight when losing wasn't an option. I used its momentum against it, redirected its attacks, made it work for every advantage. But I was losing. The wounds in my back and leg were bleeding freely, sapping my strength. The creature seemed barely winded. That's when I heard the other members of its pack climbing up the sides of the ridge. They'd given their leader time to finish me alone, but patience was running out. I had maybe 2 minutes before this became a group fight I couldn't win. The pack leader seemed to sense victory. It backed off slightly, circling me like a wolf cornering wounded prey. Its packmates were almost to the top now. I thought about my options and didn't like any of them. Then I looked at my dogs. Rex bleeding but defiant, Duke favoring his hurt leg, Bear with claw marks across his ribs, and made a decision that would haunt me for years. I pulled the last flare from my pack and held it ready. "You want to be the alpha?" I said to the creature. "Let's see how you handle fire." I cracked the flare, and it burst into brilliant red flame. The creature hissed and backed away, but there was nowhere to go on the narrow ridge. I advanced, waving the burning flare like a torch. The creature retreated step by step, but its eyes never left mine. It was still calculating, still looking for an opening. The other pack members reached the ridge just as I made my final move. Instead of trying to burn the leader, I threw the flare at its feet and charged. The creature had to choose between the fire and me. In that split second of hesitation, I tackled it around the waist and drove us both toward the edge of the ridge. We went over together. The fall should have killed us both, but a ledge about 20 feet down broke our descent. I hit hard and felt ribs crack. The creature landed beside me, stunned but still moving. Above us, the rest of the pack howled in fury. But the ledge was too narrow for them to follow safely. For the moment, it was just me and their leader. The creature rolled to its feet, shaking off the fall. It was hurt. I could see it favoring its left arm. But it wasn't finished. Neither was I. We faced each other on a ledge barely 6 feet wide. No room for fancy tactics now, just two predators in a space too small for both. "Base, this is Iron Wolf," I gasped into my radio. "I'm on a ledge about 20 feet below Eagle Ridge. Send the helicopter to the sound of gunfire." "Marcus, you said you were out of ammunition." I pulled out my emergency signal gun, the one I'd forgotten about in all the chaos. It was loaded with a single flare round meant for aerial signaling. Not anymore. The creature understood the threat. It crouched, ready to spring. I raised the signal gun and waited. One shot. Had to make it count. The creature leaped. I pulled the trigger. The flare round hit its center mass and exploded in a burst of phosphorus and flame. The creature screamed, a sound that was part animal, part human, and all pain. It clawed at the burning chemicals, eating through its flesh. Then it fell backward off the ledge. I watched it tumble into the forest below, a trail of fire and smoke marking its descent. When it hit bottom, it didn't get up. Above me, the pack howled again. But it was different this time. Not a hunting call, but something like grief or rage. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air. "Ranger Iron Wolf, this is air rescue. We have visual on your location." I looked up to see a bright yellow helicopter hovering over the ridge. A rescue basket was already dropping toward me. But the pack wasn't finished. As the basket reached the ledge, I heard them moving through the forest below. They were tracking the helicopter, trying to predict where it would land. "Tell the pilot not to set down anywhere," I radioed. "Keep it in the air until we're clear of the mountains." Getting 3 injured dogs and 1 beaten-up ranger into a rescue basket took longer than I'd hoped. Rex went first, then Duke and Bear. I was climbing into the basket myself when I saw them. The pack had reached the base of the cliff, 5 creatures standing in a loose circle around their fallen leader. As the helicopter lifted us away, they looked up at us with eyes full of intelligent hatred. The last thing I saw before we cleared the ridge was the largest of the remaining creatures picking up its leader's body. They weren't just pack hunters. They buried their dead. That's when I knew this wasn't over. The official report said bear attack. Aggressive black bear, possibly rabid, had killed 3 hunters and mauled 1 park ranger. The story made sense to people who needed things to make sense. I never corrected it. What was I supposed to say? That I'd fought creatures that walked upright, used tools, and coordinated attacks like a military unit? That they'd deliberately herded human prey through the wilderness? That their leader had challenged me to single combat? Nobody would believe it. Hell, some days I barely believe it myself. But the scars on my back believe it. The nightmares believe it. And most of all, my dogs believe it. Rex, Duke, and Bear, all recovered from their injuries, but they were never quite the same. Rex, who used to range far ahead on trails, now stays close to my side. Duke startles at unexpected sounds. Bear won't go into the forest after dark, no matter what. They remember. And they're still watching. The search teams never found the 3 hunters. Their families got death certificates based on the blood evidence at the scene, but there were no bodies. I know why. The pack took them. What I can't figure out is why they let me live. I've spent the last 5 years thinking about it, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. It wasn't mercy, it was respect. One soldier acknowledging another. The pack leader understood hierarchy, recognized authority. When I killed it in single combat, I proved my right to lead. The pack honored that, even though I was human. But respect doesn't mean they've forgiven me. I still work the Chugach wilderness, still run search and rescue operations. But now I train other rangers differently. I teach them about predators that think like humans, about the importance of working in teams, about never going into the deep woods alone. Most importantly, I teach them to listen to their dogs. Animals know things we don't. They sense dangers we can't see, track threats we can't imagine. When a good dog tells you something's wrong, you listen. Because somewhere in the mountains north of Eklutna Lake, there's a pack that remembers the ranger who killed their leader. They're watching, waiting, learning. And someday, when I'm old and slow and my dogs are gone, they'll come for me. I'll be ready. Some nights, when the wind blows down from Eagle Peak, I can hear them calling. Not the hunting howls from before, but something else. Something that sounds almost like my name. Rex hears it too. He'll lift his head from where he's lying by the fire and look toward the mountains. His ears perk up, and his eyes get that distant look that means he's remembering something important. Then he'll come over and press against my leg, reminding me that I'm not alone. None of us are alone as long as we have pack loyalty. The creatures in the mountains understand that. It's why they respected me enough to let me live. And it's why they'll keep watching until they're sure the debt is settled. But until that day comes, I'll keep doing my job. Keep bringing people home safe from the wilderness. Keep training the next generation of rangers to survive in a world where some predators think like soldiers. And every morning, when I strap on my badge and load my gear, I remember the lesson the pack leader taught me on that ridge. There's always something higher on the food chain. The question is, are you smart enough to recognize it when you see it? I was, barely. The 3 hunters weren't. Next time, I might not be either. That's why I keep my pistol loaded with silver bullets now. Call it superstition, call it paranoia, I call it insurance. Because in the deep wilderness, where civilization ends and the old rules apply, there are things that hunt humans for sport. And some of them are smart enough to hold grudges. My name is Marcus Ironwolf. I've been a park ranger for 20 years. I've seen things I can't explain, fought enemies that shouldn't exist, and survived encounters that should have killed me. And I'm still watching the tree line. Because they're still watching me. My name is Elena Ravencrest, and I need to tell you what happened at Lake Clark before they locked me up for good. I've been a park ranger for 12 years now. Before that, I spent 8 years in the Navy as a deep-sea diver. Lost my left leg in an accident off the coast of San Diego, got it crushed between 2 ships during a storm. The doctors said I'd never dive again. They were wrong. I learned to dive with a prosthetic leg because I couldn't imagine life without the water. The silence down there, the way light moves through liquid, it's the closest thing to peace I've ever known. Or it was, until August 1984. Lake Clark National Monument sits in the middle of Alaska like a secret someone forgot to share. Most people never heard of it. Tahlequah Lake is the deepest part, 1,100 feet straight down, carved by glaciers thousands of years ago. The water is so clear you can see 30 feet down on a good day. After that, it just goes black. I was there doing research on the lake's ecosystem. The Park Service wanted to know what lived in the deep water. Fish populations, plant life, that sort of thing. Simple science work. I had my gear, my underwater cameras, and my sonar equipment. Just me and the lake for 3 weeks. The Tanaina people who lived here before us had stories about Tahlequah. They called something Palrayak Lake Dragon. Old Henry Wassily, who flew supplies in once a week, told me about it while unloading my gear. My grandmother said never to swim in the deep parts, he said, not looking at the water. Said something big lived down there, something that'd been sleeping for a long, long time. I smiled and nodded. I'd heard lake monster stories before. Every deep lake has them. Loch Ness, Lake Champlain, dozens of others. Just stories to explain what people couldn't understand. But Henry wasn't done. She said the lake wasn't always here. Said it used to be a mountain until the thing underneath made it sink. He looked at me then, serious as cancer. You be careful down there, Elena. Some things better left sleeping. I set up my camp on the north shore, where the water was deepest. First few days went fine. I did shallow dives, collecting samples, taking pictures. The lake was beautiful but empty, hardly any fish at all, which was strange for water this clean and cold. On the fourth day, I took my sonar unit out to map the bottom. The readings didn't make sense. Instead of the smooth, bowl-shaped bottom I expected, the sonar showed structures, geometric shapes that looked almost like buildings. I checked the equipment 3 times. Same readings. There were structures down there, 800 feet down, arranged in perfect lines and angles. But that was impossible. No one had ever built anything that deep. No one could have. That night, I sat by my campfire, staring at the sonar printouts. The shapes were too regular to be natural. Too organized. They looked like a city, grid seen from above, if cities could exist on the bottom of 1,000-foot deep lakes. I radioed my supervisor in Anchorage, but the connection was full of static. Mountain weather coming in, he said. Check in tomorrow. The wind picked up around midnight. I could hear waves hitting the shore harder than before. But underneath the normal water sounds, I heard something else. A low vibration, like the world's biggest engine running deep underground. I told myself it was just the wind in the rocks. Just my imagination. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, the lake was perfectly still. Not a ripple anywhere. The water looked like black glass reflecting the gray sky. Even stranger, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight. In August, in Alaska, that was unusual. I suited up for a deep dive. If there really were structures down there, I needed pictures. Real evidence. My Navy training taught me to trust my instruments. And my instruments said there was something impossible sitting on the lake bottom. At 50 feet, the light started to fade. At 100 feet, I switched on my underwater lights. The water was so clear I could see the beams cutting through it like solid things. Everything was quiet except for my breathing and the hiss of my air regulator. At 200 feet, I saw the first one, a stone block, perfectly square, sitting by itself in the middle of nowhere. It was huge, maybe 10 feet on each side, and covered in symbols I'd never seen before. The symbols weren't carved into the stone. They seemed to glow from inside it, pulsing slow and steady like a heartbeat. I swam closer and took pictures. The stone was smooth as glass, but when I touched it, it felt warm. Warm stone in ice-cold water 800 feet underground. That's when I noticed the others. They stretched out in every direction as far as my lights could reach. Hundreds of them, thousands, all perfectly spaced, all glowing, with that soft, rhythmic light. Like street lamps in a drowned city. I followed the line of stones deeper. My depth gauge read 300 feet, then 400. The stones kept going. At 500 feet, I found where they all led. A wall. It rose from the lake bottom like a skyscraper, perfectly smooth and straight. I couldn't see the top, even pointing my lights straight up. The wall was made of the same glowing stone as the blocks, covered in the same pulsing symbols. But it wasn't just one wall. As I swam along it, I realized it was part of a massive structure. Walls connecting to other walls, forming rooms and corridors big enough to drive trucks through, and all of it glowing with that soft, heartbeat light. I checked my air gauge. Half tank. Time to surface. But as I started up, something caught my eye. One section of the wall had an opening. A doorway, perfectly round, about 8 feet across. Beyond it was darkness that my lights couldn't penetrate. I knew I should surface. Get more air, plan a longer dive, come back with backup equipment. That was the safe thing to do. The smart thing. Instead, I swam through the doorway. The corridor beyond was huge. My lights showed smooth walls stretching away into blackness. The ceiling was so high I couldn't see it. And everywhere, those glowing symbols pulsed like living things. I followed the corridor for maybe 50 yards before it opened into a chamber so big my lights couldn't find the walls, but I could see other corridors leading off in different directions. Dozens of them. This wasn't just one building, it was a complex. A city. That's when I heard it. A sound like breathing, but bigger than any lungs could make, slow and deep, coming from somewhere far away. Air moving through spaces larger than cathedrals. My air alarm started beeping. Time to go. I turned around and swam back the way I came, following my light beams. But the corridor seemed longer somehow. The walls felt closer, and that breathing sound was getting louder. When I finally found the doorway and swam out, I looked back. For just a second, I could swear I saw something moving in the darkness beyond my lights, something huge sliding across the opening. I shot to the surface faster than I should have. My ears popped, and I felt dizzy from coming up too quick. But I needed air, real air, and I needed to think. I floated on my back, staring up at the gray sky. What I'd seen down there was impossible. Ancient structures in a lake that was supposed to be natural. Glowing stone that felt warm to the touch. Corridors big enough for giants. And that breathing sound. I swam back to shore and dragged myself onto the rocks. My prosthetic leg felt heavy and clumsy after the weightless freedom of deep water. I sat there shivering, not from cold, but from something else. Something that felt like fear, but bigger. The lake looked innocent enough from the surface, just dark, water and reflected clouds. But I knew what was down there now. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. That night, I went through my photographs over and over. The stone blocks, the glowing symbols, the massive wall. All of it was real. The camera didn't lie. But the more I looked at the pictures, the more wrong everything felt. The symbols seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The patterns in the stone blocks looked different each time I examined them. And in one photo, the one I took of the round doorway, there was something in the darkness beyond. A shape that shouldn't have been there. I tried calling Anchorage again. Still nothing but static. The weather was getting worse. Dark clouds were building over the mountains, and the wind was picking up. I was completely cut off. The next morning, I noticed the lake level had dropped. The waterline on the rocks was 3 feet lower than when I arrived. That was impossible. Lakes don't lose that much water overnight unless something big is drinking from them. I decided to dive again, but this time I'd be smarter about it. Double air tanks, waterproof emergency radio, safety line tied to my boat. If something went wrong down there, I'd have a way out. The structures had changed. The stone blocks were in different positions. Some had moved dozens of feet from where they'd been the day before. Others were missing entirely. And new ones had appeared, forming patterns I hadn't seen before. The wall was different too. Sections that had been solid stone now had new openings. Doorways where there had been blank wall. And the glow from the symbols was brighter, pulsing faster. I swam to one of the new openings and peered inside. The corridor beyond curved away into darkness, but I could see light coming from somewhere deep inside. Not the soft glow of the symbols, but something brighter. Whiter. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The corridor spiraled down like a ramp. The walls were smooth as mirrors, covered in symbols that moved and shifted as I swam past. The light ahead got brighter with each turn. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I came to another chamber. This one was smaller than the first, maybe the size of a basketball court, but it wasn't empty. In the center sat something that made my blood freeze. A chair, or something like a chair. It was huge, big enough for something 20 feet tall. Made of the same glowing stone as everything else, but carved with details that hurt to look at. Tentacles and eyes and shapes that didn't have names. And sitting in the chair was a skeleton, but not a human skeleton. The skull was wrong, too long, with too many eye sockets. The spine had too many vertebrae, and they were twisted in ways that defied anatomy. The arms were too long, ending in hands that had too many fingers. And the whole thing was big, really big. I swam closer, taking pictures. The bones were covered in the same symbols as everything else, glowing and pulsing. But as I watched, the symbols began to move faster. The glow got brighter. The skeleton's skull turned to look at me. I screamed into my regulator, sending bubbles everywhere. My vision went white with panic. This couldn't be happening. Dead things don't move. Skeletons don't watch you. But the empty eye sockets were definitely tracking my movement now, and as I watched, the jaw opened and closed like it was trying to speak. No sound came out, just the movement of ancient bone. I spun around and swam for the corridor as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard something that shouldn't have been possible underwater, the sound of stone grinding against stone. The chair was moving, or whatever was in it was getting up. I shot through the corridors like a torpedo, following my safety line back toward the surface. But the path seemed different now. Longer. The corridors branched and split in ways they hadn't before. And behind me, getting closer, was that grinding sound. When I finally burst through the surface, I was hyperventilating so bad I almost passed out. I floated there gasping, looking back at the water. It was perfectly calm, no bubbles, no disturbance, like nothing had happened. But I knew something had followed me up. I could feel it down there, just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. I hauled myself into my boat and started the motor. I needed to get off this lake, right now. But as I pulled anchor, something grabbed the rope from underneath. The boat lurched to one side, nearly throwing me overboard. I looked down into the water and saw a hand, a huge hand with too many fingers, holding my anchor rope. I gunned the motor and cut the rope with my dive knife. The boat shot forward, but not before I saw something else rising from the deep water. A shape so big it darkened the lake. Around it, something that shouldn't exist, something that had been sleeping down there for God knows how long, and now it was waking up. I made it to shore, but barely. My boat was taking on water from somewhere, sinking fast. I grabbed my gear and waded onto the rocks just as the hull went under. The lake had gone completely still again. No waves, no ripples. The water looked like black mirror, reflecting the storm clouds gathering overhead. But I knew that calm was just the surface. Underneath, something massive was moving. That's when I understood the truth that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The lake wasn't built around those structures. The structures weren't in the lake at all. The lake was part of something bigger, something alive. I'd been diving inside a living thing. All those corridors and chambers, the glowing symbols, the massive walls, they weren't buildings. They were organs, parts of something so huge that an 1,100-foot deep lake was just a tiny portion of its body. And I had woken it up. The ground started to shake. Not earthquake, shaking something else, something rhythmic, like a giant heartbeat coming from deep underground. The trees around the lake swayed, even though there was no wind. Rocks fell from the cliffs. The water in the lake began to move. Not waves, but a slow, steady current, like breathing. The level dropped another 10 feet as whatever was down there inhaled. Then it rose as it exhaled, sending water over the banks. I tried my radio one more time. Nothing but static filled with sounds that weren't quite white noise, sounds that seemed almost like voices. Huge voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. The shaking got worse. Cracks appeared in the rocks around the lake. Steam rose from the water even though the air was cold. And the smell like ozone and decay and something else. Something organic and ancient. That's when I saw the eye. The entire lake. Surface bulged upward, then split open like a giant eyelid. Beneath was an eye the size of a football field. Black as space, but filled with stars that weren't stars. Patterns that moved and shifted like the symbols on the stones. The eye looked up at the sky, then slowly turned to look at me. I felt its attention like physical weight. Not malevolent exactly, just vast, alien. I was an ant looking up at a mountain, trying to understand what a mountain thinks about. In that moment, I knew things I wasn't supposed to know. I saw the truth about the lake, about the structures, about what had been sleeping here for millions of years. This thing was old when the glaciers first came. It had watched the ice age come and go. It had seen the first humans cross the land bridge from Asia. It had been here when the Tenina people first found the lake and learned to fear it. And now, because of my diving, my lights, my disturbance of its rest, it was waking up completely. This eye blinked, and the world changed. The mountains around the lake began to sink. Trees aged and died in seconds, crumbling to dust. The sky turned colors that don't have names. And I understood that reality itself was just a thin layer over something much stranger and more terrible. The thing beneath the lake was so big that physics bent around it, so old that time worked differently in its presence. And it was looking at me like I was a curious insect. Then, suddenly, the attention moved away. The eye closed, the shaking stopped. The world snapped back to normal, like a rubber band released. The thing had decided I wasn't important enough to bother with. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt crushed by my own insignificance. In the face of something that vast, that eternal, human life seemed like nothing more than a brief flicker of electricity in dead meat. I sat by that lake for 3 more days, waiting for Henry's supply flight. The weather cleared, but I never tried to radio out again. What would I say? How do you explain that you've seen something that shouldn't exist, something so big that your entire reality is just a small part of its dreams? When Henry finally arrived, he took one look at my face and knew something had changed. "You went too deep," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Way too deep. My grandmother always said the lake was just the tip of something bigger, something that's been here since before the world was the world. He looked out at the calm water. Said if you ever woke it up all the way, it would change everything, make the world different. It didn't wake up all the way, I said. It looked at me and decided I wasn't worth its time. Henry helped me load my gear into his plane. As we flew away from Telequana Lake, I looked back one more time. The water was perfectly still, perfectly normal. You'd never guess what was sleeping underneath. But I knew, and that knowledge changed everything. I quit the park service a month later. Couldn't handle being outdoors anymore. Couldn't stand open spaces where something huge might be hiding underneath. I moved to a small apartment in downtown Anchorage, somewhere with lots of walls and other people around. The nightmares started right away. Dreams of vast corridors filled with pulsing light, dreams of swimming through blood vessels the size of subway tunnels, dreams of that eye, bigger than cities, watching everything with patient intelligence. They kept me in psychiatric observation for 6 weeks after I told the first doctor what had happened. Delusional episode brought on by isolation stress, they called it. They wanted to put me on medication, but I refused. The visions weren't delusions. They were memories. The official report said I'd suffered equipment failure and lost my research data. The lake was declared temporarily off-limits due to geological instability. As far as I know, no one has dived there since. Sometimes I wonder if the thing is still sleeping, or if my disturbance started something that can't be stopped. Sometimes I read about earthquakes in Alaska and wonder if it's stretching in its sleep. When scientists talk about climate change and shifting weather patterns, I think about something so big that its breathing could change the world. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. I live quietly now. Work at a small marine supply shop, help other people with their diving gear. I never dive anymore. Can't stand the thought of deep water, of not knowing what might be looking up at me from below. People think I'm crazy, and maybe I am. But I know what I saw down there. I know what's sleeping beneath Lake Clark. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I can still feel its attention turning my way. Just for a moment, just long enough to remind me that I'm not important enough to worry about. And somehow, that's the most terrifying thing of all. My name is Thomas Nightshade, and I've been a park ranger for 18 years. I work at Gates of the Arctic National Monument in Alaska, in a place called the Arrogech Peaks. It's the most remote wilderness in North America. For the past 12 years, I've run special programs for troubled kids, the ones everyone else has given up on. I never believed children could be truly evil. Damaged, yes. Hurt, confused, angry, absolutely. But evil? No. Environment shapes kids, not some dark force inside them. That's what I always told the other rangers, the social workers, even the parents who'd drive hundreds of miles just to dump their problem children at my camps. I was wrong about that. It's December 15th, 1987, day 23 of polar night here in the Arctic. The sun hasn't shown its face in weeks, and it won't for another month. Most people can't handle this kind of darkness. It presses down on you like a living thing, making you see shadows that aren't there, hear voices in the wind. I'm alone at Research Station Delta 7, 200 miles from the nearest settlement. My job this winter is simple. Monitor weather patterns, check equipment, and radio and daily reports via satellite phone. The isolation doesn't bother me. After my divorce 3 years ago, I actually prefer it. The station is a sturdy log building with solar batteries and a backup generator. I've got enough supplies for 3 months, emergency medical equipment, and all the survival gear a man could need. The nearest neighbors are caribou and the occasional wolf pack. Or so I thought. 3 days ago, I started seeing them. Children. It was just after my evening radio check-in. I was warming up some coffee when I saw movement outside the main window. At first, I figured it was just the aurora borealis playing tricks with my eyes. The northern lights have been especially active lately, casting green and purple shadows across the snow. But then I saw them clearly. 3 kids, maybe 8 or 9 years old, playing in the snow about 50 yards from the station. They were building what looked like a snow fort, laughing and throwing snowballs at each other. Normal kid stuff, except it was 47 degrees below zero outside. They weren't wearing coats, just regular clothes, jeans, sneakers, thin shirts, the kind of outfit that would kill an adult in minutes out there. I grabbed my binoculars and looked again. The kids were still there, still playing, their breath not even showing in the frigid air. One of them, a little girl with dark braids, looked right at me and waved. I dropped the binoculars and ran for my Arctic gear. By the time I got my boots on and reached the door, they were gone. No footprints in the snow. Nothing. Isolation psychosis, I told myself. Cabin fever. It happens to solo rangers all the time, especially during polar night. The mind plays tricks when it's deprived of sunlight and human contact for too long. But deep down, something felt different about this. Wrong. I've handled isolation before. Done solo winter assignments in remote stations across Alaska. I know what hallucinations feel like. They're fuzzy around the edges. Dreamlike. These kids looked absolutely real. Solid. I could see the details of their faces, the way their hair moved in the wind. That night, I tried calling my supervisor in Fairbanks, but atmospheric interference kept breaking up the signal. All I could manage was Delta 7 reporting in. All equipment functional, weather holding steady. I didn't mention the children. What would I say? That I saw 3 kids playing outside in lethal cold? That they vanished without a trace? I'd be pulled off the assignment and sent for psychological evaluation. But as I lay in my sleeping bag that night, listening to the wind howl across the peaks, I couldn't shake the image of that little girl waving at me. There had been something in her eyes, something that didn't belong in a child's face. Something that knew exactly who I was. They came back the next night. This time there were 5 of them. 3 boys and 2 girls, all around the same age. They appeared just after sunset. Well, what passes for sunset when you haven't seen the sun in weeks? The aurora was dancing again, casting everything in an eerie green glow. I was checking the weather instruments when I heard it. Children's laughter. Not the joyful kind you hear at playgrounds. This was different. Sharper. Like glass breaking in the distance. I looked out the window, and there they were, closer this time, maybe 30 yards away. They were playing some kind of game, running in circles around what looked like a pile of rocks. But as I watched, I realized it wasn't rocks at all. It was bones. Animal bones, arranged in a careful pattern. The children danced around them, holding hands and singing something I couldn't quite make out. Their voices carried clearly across the snow, even though they should have been muffled by the wind. I grabbed my satellite phone and tried to call base again. Static. Then, clear as day, I heard a child's voice come through the receiver. "Mr. Nightshade? Mr. Nightshade, can you come play with us?" I nearly dropped the phone. Nobody knew I was here except my supervisor. And how would kids get access to a satellite frequency? I looked back out the window. One of the boys, maybe 10 years old with sandy hair, was standing right outside the glass, his face pressed against it. His breath wasn't fogging the window. "Hello, Mr. Nightshade," he said, and somehow I could hear him perfectly through the thick glass and insulated walls. "We've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, knocking over my coffee cup. Hot liquid splashed across my hands, the burn sharp and real. When I looked up again, the boy was gone. But there were handprints on the outside of the window. Small ones, like a child would make, and they were glowing faintly in the aurora light. I spent the rest of the night checking and rechecking the doors and windows. Everything was locked tight. The handprints were still there in the morning, frozen into the ice that had formed on the glass. By day 3, I was starting to lose it. The children came earlier each night. They got bolder too. I'd find small objects moved around the station, my coffee mug in a different spot, books rearranged on the shelf. Nothing major, just enough to let me know they'd been inside. But that was impossible. I checked every lock, every seal. There was no way in except through the main door, and that had 3 deadbolts. On the 4th night, I decided to confront them. I loaded my rifle not to hurt children, of course, but to feel safer. Then I put on my Arctic gear and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a physical blow. Even through my insulated suit, the air was so frigid it burned my lungs. No living child could survive out here for more than a few minutes. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small and lost in the vast darkness. "Is anyone out there?" Silence. Just the wind whistling through the peaks. Then I heard it. "Behind you, Mr. Nightshade." I spun around. A little girl was standing right next to the station door, the same one who had waved at me that first night. She was wearing a summer dress and sandals, her dark braids tied with yellow ribbons. "You're going to freeze," I said, my breath coming out in white puffs. "You need to get inside." She smiled, and that's when I noticed her teeth. They were too sharp, too many of them. "We don't get cold anymore," she said. "We haven't been cold in a very long time." "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah Kensington. I died here in 1962. Her smile got wider. "My daddy brought me and my brothers camping. We got lost in a blizzard. The world seemed to tilt around me. This couldn't be happening. Children don't just die and keep wandering around for 25 years. "You're not real," I whispered. "Oh, we're real, Mr. Nightshade. We're the realest things you'll ever meet." She took a step closer, and I noticed she wasn't leaving footprints in the snow. "We know all about you. About the children you couldn't save." My blood went cold, and not from the Arctic air. "We know about Marcus," she continued. "The boy who ran away from your camp last summer. They found him 3 days later, didn't they? Frozen solid in that creek. Marcus Fletcher. 11 years old, angry at the world because his parents couldn't handle him anymore. He'd slipped out of camp during the night, trying to walk home to Anchorage. By the time we found him, it was too late. I'd never forgiven myself for that. And little Amy," Sarah said, her voice like winter wind. "Sweet Amy, who trusted you so much, right up until the grizzly got her." "Stop it." My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. "You collect broken children, Mr. Nightshade, but you break more than you fix, don't you?" I raised the rifle, not really aiming it at her. She was still a child, real or not, but she just laughed. "Guns don't work on us. We're already dead. But we can make you join us, if you'd like." "Would you like that, Mr. Nightshade? To stay here forever and play with us?" I backed toward the station door, fumbling for the handle. "Think about it," Sarah called after me. "We'll be waiting." When I got inside and locked the door, I slumped against it, gasping. Through the window, I could see all 5 children standing in a line, watching the station, watching me. They stayed there until dawn, perfectly still, never blinking. And that's when I realized they weren't just ghosts, they were hunting. The attack started on the 5th night. I'd barely managed to eat anything all day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's too sharp smile, heard her voice talking about Marcus and Amy. The guilt was eating me alive, which I think was exactly what she wanted. Around midnight, I heard scratching at the walls, soft at first, like mice in the insulation, then louder, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. I grabbed my flashlight and checked every window, nothing. But the scratching continued, moving around the station in a slow circle. They were testing the walls, looking for weak spots. "Go away," I shouted. "Leave me alone." The scratching stopped. Then I heard Sarah's voice, seeming to come from inside the walls themselves. "Tell us about Rebecca, Mr. Nightshade." My blood turned to ice. Rebecca was a name I'd buried deep, tried never to think about. "We know you remember her," said another voice, one of the boys. 13 years old. Your very first failure. Rebecca Martinez. My first year as a ranger, working youth programs in Denali. She'd been sent to my wilderness camp by the court system. A troubled kid from Anchorage who'd been caught stealing cars. I thought I could help her. I thought the wilderness would heal whatever was broken inside her. She trusted you. Sarah's voice drifted through the walls. Just like all the others. The scratching started again, more violent this time. I could hear them climbing on the roof now, small feet running back and forth above my head. She wrote you letters, didn't she? Said the boy's voice. Even after she went back home. Even after her parents sent her to that place. Rebecca had written me 3 letters from the psychiatric facility, begging me to come get her, saying the other kids there were hurting her, saying she needed help. I never answered those letters. You could have saved her, Sarah whispered. But you didn't want the responsibility. The scratching suddenly stopped. The station fell silent except for the wind outside. Then the lights went out. My emergency generator should have kicked in automatically. It was designed to handle power failures, equipped with backup systems and redundant safety features. But everything was dead. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating my small living space. Everything looked normal. Then I saw the footprints. Wet, muddy footprints leading from the door to my sleeping bag. Small ones. Child-sized. But the door was still locked from the inside. I followed the trail with my flashlight beam. The prints led to my bunk, then up the wall. Impossible prints that defied gravity, as if someone had walked straight up to the ceiling. That's when I noticed the smell. Sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. Rebecca killed herself, you know? Sarah's voice came from right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and the stench of decay. Jumped from the 4th-floor window of the hospital. They said she'd been planning it for weeks. I pressed my back against the wall, sweeping the flashlight beam across the room. This isn't real. You're not real. She left a note. The boy's voice added. Want to know what it said? I didn't answer, but he told me anyway. It said, Mr. Nightshade was supposed to help me. He promised he would help me. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I'd tried so hard to forget Rebecca, to convince myself there was nothing I could have done. But these things, these dead children, they knew the truth. I'd failed her. Just like I'd failed Marcus and Amy. Just like I was failing now. The flashlight started flickering. In the dying light, I caught glimpses of movement around the station. Small shapes darting between the shadows. Children's laughter echoing from impossible places. We want to play a game, Mr. Nightshade, Sarah said. Her voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A game about guilt and punishment. The flashlight died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. The rules are simple, she continued. We show you all the children you failed, every single one, and you tell us why they deserved to die while you got to live. Images flashed in my mind, memories I'd tried to bury. Marcus's frozen body in the creek, Amy's terrified screams before the bear attack, Rebecca's final letter, crumpled and thrown in my trash. Dozen of other faces too, kids who'd passed through my programs over the years. Some I'd helped, sure, but others I'd given up on. Labeled as too difficult and sent back to foster care or juvenile detention. How many of them were dead now? How many had I failed? You collect broken children, Sarah whispered, her breath cold against my ear. But you're the one who's truly broken, aren't you? I fumbled for my backup generator switch. My hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Finally I found it and pulled. The lights flickered back on. The station was full of children, at least 20 of them, standing perfectly still, all staring at me. Boys and girls ranging from maybe 6 to 15 years old, all wearing the clothes they'd dyed and some in hospital gowns, others in torn winter gear, a few in what looked like formal funeral attire. And all of them had the same expression on their faces. Infinite sadness mixed with cold, patient hunger. Hello, Mr. Nightshade, they said in unison. We've been waiting so long to meet you. I ran for the satellite phone, desperate to call for help. But when I picked up the receiver, all I heard was children crying. Dozens of voices, weeping and calling my name. Please help us, Mr. Nightshade. Why didn't you save us? We're so cold here. We're so alone. I dropped the phone and backed toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The deadbolts were frozen solid, ice crystals spreading across the metal like living things. There's nowhere to run, Sarah said, stepping forward from the group. This is where you belong. With us. With all the children you let down. The temperature in the station was dropping fast. I could see my breath now, and frost was forming on the windows. The dead children moved closer, their eyes reflecting the artificial light like animals in the dark. We have an offer for you, Sarah continued, a way to make up for all your failures. I pressed my back against the frozen door, trapped. What kind of offer? She smiled that terrible sharp smile. Bring us living children, Mr. Nightshade. Bring us children who are still warm and breathing and full of life. Feed them to this place, and we'll forgive your past failures. The other children nodded in agreement, their movements perfectly synchronized. Think about it, Sarah said. Your youth programs give you access to so many troubled kids. Kids nobody would miss for a while. You could bring them here, for special wilderness therapy. Who would question the great Thomas Nightshade? Horror washed over me as I realized what she was suggesting. You want me to murder children? We want you to balance the scales, she replied. You've let so many die through your negligence. Now actively save yourself by giving us what we need. The other children stepped closer. I could smell death on them now, earth and decay, and the sickly sweet scent of flowers at a funeral. Fresh children, Sarah whispered. Young ones, full of hope and trust. Bring them to us, and you can live. Refuse. She didn't need to finish the threat. I could see it in their eyes, all of them. They would keep me here forever if I said no, make me one of them. But the alternative was unthinkable. I won't, I said, my voice cracking. I won't hurt children for you. Sarah's expression didn't change, but the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Ice began forming on the walls. Then you'll stay here with us, she said simply. Forever. The dead children moved as one, forming a circle around me. The temperature kept dropping 20 below, 30 below, 40. My breath came in sharp white puffs, and frost began forming on my eyebrows. Last chance, Mr. Nightshade, Sarah said. Her voice had changed, becoming deeper, more adult somehow. Bring us living children, or become one of us. I thought about all the kids in my programs back in Fairbanks. Troubled teenagers, sure, but still full of potential. Still capable of changing their lives around. I thought about 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez, who'd just been placed in foster care after his parents died. About Maria Santos, who'd started trusting adults again after years of abuse. Could I really lead them here to save myself? No, I said firmly. I've failed children before, but I won't murder them. Sarah tilted her head, studying me like I was some interesting insect. Even if it means dying? Even if it means leaving all those other children without their beloved teacher? It was a good point. If I died here, who would run the wilderness programs? Who would help the kids who came after? But I knew the answer. Someone else would step up, someone better than me, probably. Someone who wouldn't fail like I had. I said no. The circle of children tightened around me. Their eyes had gone completely black now, like empty sockets in their pale faces. Then you understand what comes next? Sarah said. That's when I heard it. Another voice, older and deeper than the children's. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very foundations of the station. Enough. The children stopped moving. Sarah's head snapped up, her black eyes suddenly wide with fear. He has chosen, the voice continued. He will not sacrifice the living for the dead. He will not repeat the sins of his past. But he failed us, Sarah protested. He let us die. Yes, the voice agreed. Through negligence, through fear, through simple human weakness. But when offered the chance to actively harm children for his own benefit, he refused. That matters. The temperature in the station began to rise. The ice on the walls started melting, dripping onto the floor. We are not here to punish failure, the voice said. We are here to test character. This man has passed. Sarah looked at me with something that might have been respect. You would really rather die than hurt a child? Yes, I said without hesitation. She smiled then, not the terrible sharp smile from before, but something sadder and more human. Most adults we test choose themselves. They always choose themselves. Who are you? I asked. What are you really? We are the Tornarsuk, said the boy who'd been standing next to Sarah. The Inupiat people knew of us long before white men came to this land. We are the spirits who test adults to see if they truly care for a poor, children, or only claim to. The children you spoke of, Sarah added. Marcus, Amy, Rebecca, they were real failures, real pain. We used your guilt about them because guilt makes the test harder. The other children began to fade, becoming translucent in the artificial light. Only Sarah remained solid. You carry great guilt, Thomas Nightshade, she said, but you have proven that your care for children runs deeper than your fear of death. That is unusual. What happens now? I asked. Now you leave this place, she replied. You go back to your work. But you will be changed by this experience. You will be more careful, more aware of your responsibilities. I thought about that. Will I see you again? Perhaps. If you ever forget the lesson of this place, if you ever again treat children's lives carelessly, we will return. Her smile was sad now, almost gentle. But we do not think that will happen. The station door swung open on its own, letting in a gust of Arctic air. But it felt warm compared to what I'd just experienced. Go, Sarah said. Your satellite phone will work now. Call for extraction. I gathered my essential gear and headed for the door. As I reached it, I turned back. The children who really did die, Marcus, and the others, are they at peace? Sarah considered this. Death is not a punishment, Thomas Nightshade. It is simply the end of one story and the beginning of another. The children who died in your care bear you no ill will. They understand that you tried, even when you failed. Relief flooded through me, so intense it made my knees weak. Thank you. She was already fading, becoming transparent like the others. Remember this night. Remember that protecting children is worth any sacrifice, even your own life. I stepped outside into the polar night. The aurora was dancing overhead, more beautiful than I'd ever seen it. My satellite phone crackled to life in my hands. Delta 7-2, base. Emergency extraction required. Repeat, emergency extraction required. My supervisor's voice came through clearly. Tom, what's your status? Are you injured? I looked back at the station. It was completely dark now, looking abandoned. Negative on injuries, I said. But I need to come home. The helicopter picked me up 2 days later. I told my supervisor I'd had equipment failures and possible signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. He didn't question it. Hallucinations and paranoia are common symptoms. And it explained my urgent extraction request. I never told anyone the real story. Back in Fairbanks, I tried to return to my normal routine. But everything had changed. I found myself watching the children in my programs more carefully, listening more closely to what they weren't saying. The guilt I'd carried over Marcus and Amy and Rebecca was still there, but it was different now, less crushing, more purposeful. I started a new policy. No child left alone. Ever. If a kid went to the bathroom, they took a buddy. If someone wanted to walk to the lake, they went in groups of 3 minimum. Some of the other rangers thought I was being paranoid, but they went along with it. 3 weeks after my return, I got a letter from Rebecca's mother. She'd found my address somehow, tracked me down after all these years. The letter was short. I wanted you to know that Rebecca spoke about you often before she died. She said you were the only adult who ever really listened to her. She didn't blame you for what happened. I thought you should know that. I cried when I read it. Cried for the first time since my divorce. A month later, I made a decision. I put in for a transfer to a different station, somewhere warmer and less isolated. My supervisor approved it without question. Solo Arctic assignments take their toll on everyone eventually. But I didn't stop working with troubled kids. If anything, I threw myself into it more, completely than before. I started a new program in Denali for at-risk youth, focusing on building trust and communication rather than just wilderness survival. The program was a success. Over the next 5 years, I helped more than 200 kids find their way back from the edge. Not all of them, of course. You can't save everyone. But I learned to recognize my limits and work within them rather than pretending they didn't exist. I never returned to Gates of the Arctic. Sometimes, on winter nights when the aurora is dancing, I think about Sarah and the other children. I wonder if they're still out there, testing other adults who work with kids. Part of me hopes they are. Because here's what I learned that night in the polar darkness. Anyone who works with children will face moments when they have to choose between their own safety and a child's welfare. Most of us like to think we'd always choose the child. But until you're actually tested, until you're faced with real consequences for doing the right thing, you can't know for sure. I know now. When it mattered most, when everything was on the line, I chose to protect children rather than save myself. That knowledge changed me, made me better at my job, more careful with the trust kids place in adults. It also gave me nightmares for the better part of a year. But it was worth it. Last month, I got a postcard with no return address, just a picture of the aurora borealis dancing over snow-covered peaks. On the back, in a child's handwriting, "Thank you for remembering us. I keep that postcard on my desk at work. It reminds me that somewhere in the Arctic darkness, the children of endless night are still watching, still testing, still making sure that the adults who claim to care about kids really mean it. And I'm glad they are. Because some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. Some responsibilities are sacred, especially when no one is watching, to make sure you fulfill them." Research Station Delta 7 was permanently closed after my incident. Officially, it was due to budget constraints. But I know better. The children found what they were looking for there. They don't need that place anymore. But they're still out there, waiting for the next adult who needs to be tested. I hope whoever it is makes the right choice. The children are watching. They're always watching. My name is Samuel Grimm, and I've spent the last 25 years protecting some of Alaska's most remote places. Before that, I worked crime scenes in Detroit for 12 years, identifying bodies that nobody else could name. I came to Alaska to get away from all that death, but it seems like death found me anyway. I never believed the dead could literally rise and walk. That was before October 1992, before Organic Island, before I learned that some things are worse than murder. I was stationed at Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge, specializing in archaeological site protection. Sounds boring, right? Most days, it was just paperwork and checking on old Alutiiq burial grounds to make sure treasure hunters hadn't disturbed them. The native people had been burying their dead on these islands for thousands of years, and my job was to keep those graves safe. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A fishing boat had reported seeing people with shovels on Uganik Island's north shore, right where the old burial caves were. By the time I got there in my patrol boat, they were gone. But the damage was done. Someone had torn apart 3 ancient graves. Bones were scattered everywhere. Skulls rolled down the beach like coconuts. Rib cages split apart. Arm and leg bones thrown around like driftwood. It made me sick. In my forensics days, I'd seen plenty of disrespected bodies. But this was different. These people had been at peace for centuries. I started documenting everything with my camera, just like I used to do at crime scenes. The weather was getting bad. October storms in Alaska don't mess around. Dark clouds were rolling in from the west, and the wind was picking up. I needed to work fast. That's when I noticed something weird. Some of the scattered bones were arranged, not randomly thrown around like I'd first thought. A skull sat perfectly upright next to a neat pile of vertebrae. 3 femur bones lay parallel to each other, like someone had lined them up. But the looters were long gone. I called it in on my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Grimm. The burial site has been vandalized, but something's not right here. I'm going to stay overnight and document everything properly." "Copy that, Sam," came the crackling voice of my supervisor, Janet. "Weather Service says a big storm's coming. You sure you don't want to head back?" I looked at the scattered bones of people who'd been sleeping peacefully for maybe 1,000 years. "No, I owe it to them to do this right. I'll be fine." That was the last time I talked to anyone for 3 days. By evening, the storm hit hard. Rain came down like bullets, and waves crashed against the rocky shore so loud I couldn't hear myself think. I set up my tent in the lee of some big rocks, away from the burial site. Even though I wasn't superstitious, something about sleeping right next to disturbed graves didn't feel right. Around midnight, the wind died down for a few minutes. In That sudden quiet, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A soft clicking sound, like someone tapping pebbles together. Tap, tap, click. Tap, tap, click. It was coming from the direction of the burial caves. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. The rain had stopped, but everything was still dripping. My light beam cut through the darkness toward the graves. The bones had moved. The skull that had been sitting upright was now 20 feet away, facing my tent. The neat pile of vertebrae had become a perfect spiral pattern. And those 3 parallel femur bones, they were gone completely. I've investigated hundreds of crime scenes. I know how evidence can shift in wind and rain. But bones don't arrange themselves in geometric patterns. Bones don't disappear. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my tent with my service pistol in my lap, listening to that soft clicking sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When morning came, I found my boat smashed against the rocks. The storm had destroyed my only way off the island. The radio was dead too. Water had gotten into the electronics during the storm. I was completely cut off, alone on an 8-mile-long island with about 3 days of food, and the bones were still moving. In daylight, it was even more obvious. I'd marked the position of every major bone fragment in my crime scene photos. Now, comparing those photos to what I saw in front of me, nothing was where it should be. It was like the bones were creeping towards some central point when I wasn't looking. I tried to think like a cop. Maybe animals were moving them? But what kind of animal arranges bones in patterns? Maybe the ground was shifting from all the rain? But the rocks and my equipment hadn't moved at all. I decided to run an experiment. I took one of the scattered arm bones and placed it on a flat rock where I could see it clearly from my tent. Then I went back and watched. For 2 hours, nothing happened. I was starting to feel foolish. Then I blinked, and the bone was gone. I ran to the rock. The bone lay on the ground about 10 feet away, pointing directly toward the main burial cave. There were no tracks in the mud around it, no sign of how it had moved. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. It felt normal, old, dry, cold. Just bone. But as I held it, I could swear I felt a tiny vibration, like it was humming. That afternoon, I started finding them everywhere. Not just the bones from the vandalized graves, but others too. Old, white bones poking up through the soil all over the island. It was like the whole place was spitting up its dead. I tried to stay logical. Alaska's permafrost preserves bodies for centuries. Maybe the storm had just washed away enough topsoil to expose bones that had been buried shallow. That made sense, right? Then I found the first complete skeleton. It was lying on its back near the water, arms crossed over, its chest like it had been properly laid out for burial. But this wasn't an old grave. This was on sand that had been underwater 6 hours ago during high tide. Someone, or something, had assembled this skeleton from scattered pieces and placed it here while I was sleeping. I took pictures from every angle. The bones were different ages and sizes. The skull was definitely from one of the vandalized graves. I recognized the distinctive crack in the forehead, but the rib cage looked newer, and the leg bones were too short. It was like someone had built a skeleton from spare parts. The worst part? It looked comfortable, peaceful, like it was just taking a nap on the beach. I spent the rest of the day walking the island, documenting what I found. 7 more complete skeletons, all arranged in different positions, some sitting against trees, some lying in shallow depressions that looked like natural graves. One was even arranged in what looked like a running pose, like it had been frozen mid-sprint. Each one was assembled from mismatched bones. Each one looked somehow right, like they belonged exactly where they were. As the sun went down, I made a disturbing discovery. The burial cave where the looters had done most of their damage was completely empty. Every single bone fragment was gone. The cave that had been ankle-deep in scattered remains that morning was now just bare rock and sand. They were all outside now, all walking around at night, building themselves new bodies from whatever pieces they could find. I was camped in the middle of a skeleton army. That second night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in my tent with my flashlight and pistol, listening to sounds I didn't want to understand. Soft, scraping noises like fingernails on rock, quiet clicking like bones tapping together, and underneath it all, a sound that might have been whispering. Around 3 a.m., I got brave enough to look outside. They were everywhere. dozens of white shapes moving slowly through the darkness, some complete, some still assembling themselves as they walked. I watched one skeleton pick up a skull from the ground and place it on its own shoulders, then continue walking like nothing had happened. They weren't attacking anything. They weren't being aggressive. They were just busy, moving with purpose, like they had important work to do. One of them walked right past my tent, close enough that I could have reached out and touched it. It was carrying what looked like a child's rib cage, holding it carefully like a precious gift. Its skull turned toward me for a moment, and I saw dark sockets that might have been looking right at me. Then it continued on toward the center of the island. They were all heading in the same direction. On the third morning, I followed them. The trail was easy enough to find, dozens of bone impressions in the soft earth, all leading inland toward the island's highest point. I'd never explored that area before. My job was protecting the coastal burial sites, and the interior was supposed to be empty. I was wrong. The skeletons had built a city. Not a modern city, obviously. Something older, more like what this island might have looked like 1,000 years ago. Dozens of circular arrangements where bones had been carefully placed to mark out what looked like house foundations, larger structures that might have been community buildings. Even what looked like roads, clear paths between the bone circles, wide enough for people to walk. And in the center of it all, they were building something big. It rose about 15 feet high, made entirely of bones fitted together like puzzle pieces. Not random stacking. This was architecture. Skulls formed perfect arches. Rib cages created elaborate supports. Arm and leg bones were woven together in complex patterns that somehow held the whole structure up. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And it was growing. As I watched from behind a tree, more skeletons arrived carrying bones. They seemed to know exactly where each piece belonged. A skeleton would approach the structure, hold up the bone it carried, and another skeleton would point to a specific spot. The first one would place the bone there, and it would fit perfectly. They were rebuilding something, some structure that had been destroyed long ago, now being reconstructed from the scattered remains of its builders. I tried to back away quietly, but my boot snapped a branch. Every skull in the construction site turned toward me at once, maybe 30 skeletons, all looking directly at where I was hiding. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then one of them, the largest one, built from what looked like the bones of a giant, pointed at me. The others began walking in my direction, not running, not aggressive, just walking steadily forward with that same purposeful movement I'd seen all. I ran. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not the chaotic sounds of a mob, but coordinated footsteps. They were hunting me like a pack, moving together, probably trying to cut off my escape routes. These weren't mindless zombies. They were thinking, planning, working together. I made it back to my campsite and grabbed my gear. The skeletons were maybe 5 minutes behind me. I needed a place to hide, somewhere they couldn't follow. The burial caves. Ironic, right? I was going to hide from the dead in their own graves. The main cave went back about 50 feet into the hillside. I crawled all the way to the back and waited. Through the cave mouth, I could see white shapes moving around outside. They knew where I was, but for some reason, they weren't coming in. I spent the rest of the day in that cave, thinking about what I'd seen. These weren't evil spirits or monsters. They were builders, creators. They had a project they were working on, something important enough to bring them back from whatever passed for rest. The vandals had scattered their bones, destroyed their graves, interrupted their eternal sleep. Now they were trying to put their world back together. And I was the only living person who could witness it. As evening approached, the sounds outside changed. Instead of random movement, I heard organized activity, scraping, tapping, grinding. They were building something right outside the cave. When I finally got brave enough to look, I saw what they'd done. They'd built a wall, not to keep me in. There were plenty of gaps I could crawl through if I wanted, but to give me privacy, to show me that they weren't trying to hurt me. In the center of the wall, they'd arranged bones to spell out words in letters 3 feet tall. Help us. I came out of the cave slowly, hands visible, trying not to seem threatening. The skeletons waited in a semicircle around the entrance, still as statues. The giant one stepped forward and held out what looked like a piece of carved ivory. When I took it, I realized it was a bone fragment with symbols carved into it. Alutiic writing, I thought, though I couldn't read it, but somehow I understood. They showed me what had happened, not in words, but in images that appeared in my mind when I held the carved bone. I saw their village as it had been centuries ago, a thriving community on this island, people living in houses built from whalebone and driftwood, fishing and hunting and raising children. I saw them dying, one by one, from disease brought by Russian fur traders. I saw the survivors carefully burying their dead in the traditional way, with proper ceremonies and grave goods. I saw them building the great bone structure, not a building, but a monument, a way to honor all the dead and keep their spirits together. And I saw the years passing, the village abandoned, the monument falling apart, the dead scattered by storms and time, and finally by men with shovels who saw only valuable artifacts instead of sacred remains. The skeletons weren't trying to hurt anyone, they just wanted to finish their monument. They wanted their people to be properly honored instead of scattered like trash across the beach. But they needed a living person to help them. Some parts of the monument required careful placement that only hands with flesh could manage. Some of the heavy pieces needed lifting strength that bone alone couldn't provide. They'd been waiting for someone to come along who would understand. The carved bone grew warm in my hands, and suddenly I could see what they needed me to do. There were specific bones that had to be placed in exact positions, key pieces that would allow the rest of the structure to stand properly. And there was a ceremony, words that had to be spoken by someone still alive. I looked at the assembled skeletons, maybe 50 of them now, all waiting patiently for my answer. "I'll help," I said. "But I need to understand something first. Will you be able to rest when this is finished?" The giant skeleton nodded once. "And you won't hurt anyone who comes to the island in the future?" Another nod. "Okay," I said, "show me what to do." We worked through the night. The skeletons would carry bones to the monument and indicate where they needed to go, and I would lift them into place. Some of the pieces were incredibly heavy, full rib cages, massive skulls that must have come from people who'd been giants in life. But somehow, I found the strength to move them. As the structure grew, I began to understand its design. It wasn't just a pile of bones. It was a map of the village as it had been, with each set of remains representing a family or clan. The large pieces marked important gathering places. The smaller bones traced out paths and boundaries. It was a three-dimensional memory of an entire community. By dawn, we were almost finished. Only one piece remained, a single skull that had to be placed at the very top. The giant skeleton handed it to me with what seemed like reverence. As I climbed the bone structure to place the final piece, I felt the carved ivory fragment grow hot in my pocket. Words came to me in a language I didn't know, but I spoke them anyway. "Rest now, people of the island. Your village is remembered. Your stories are preserved. Sleep in peace until the world ends." The moment the skull clicked into place, everything went quiet. No wind, no waves, no bird sounds. Even my own heartbeat seemed to stop. Then, one by one, the skeletons began to fall apart. Not collapsing or crumbling, but gently disassembling. Bones settled softly to the ground around the base of the monument, forming natural-looking piles that might have been there for centuries. In moments, I was alone with a magnificent bone sculpture that looked like it had been built by ancient hands and weathered by time into something that belonged perfectly on this island. The dead were finally at rest. The Coast Guard found me 3 days later, unconscious beside the monument. I'd apparently collapsed from exhaustion and exposure. When they asked what happened, I told them I couldn't remember anything after the storm hit. Just woke up next to this amazing archaeological discovery. They believed me. The monument was obviously very old, probably exposed by the storm. The bone arrangements around its base looked completely natural. There was no evidence of recent construction or disturbance. I never told anyone what really happened on Uganik Island. Who would believe it? Instead, I threw myself into protecting the site. I wrote reports, applied for grants, contacted universities. Within 6 months, the entire area was designated as a protected archaeological zone. No one would ever disturb those bones again. But I changed after that experience. I started learning about Alutiiq, culture, studying their language and traditions. I began working with tribal elders to identify other sacred sites that needed protection. I became a different kind of ranger, not just someone who enforced rules, but someone who understood why those rules mattered. The carved bone fragment stayed warm in my pocket for weeks after I left the island. Eventually, it cooled down and became just another piece of old ivory. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can still feel it humming. I've been back to Uganik Island dozens of times over the years. The monument stands exactly as we left it, weathering slowly but remaining strong. Visitors think it's beautiful. Scientists call it one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Alaska. None of them notice that on clear nights, when the moon is full and the wind is calm, you can sometimes see faint lights moving around the bone structure. Gentle, peaceful lights that dance between the carefully placed remains. The dead are at rest, but they're not gone. They're home, watching over their island, making sure their people are remembered. And I'm watching over them, making sure they're never disturbed again. My name is Samuel Grimm, and I've learned that some jobs are worth doing even after you're dead. The bone collectors of Kodiak taught me that the past doesn't just disappear. It waits patiently for someone who cares enough to help it find peace. I never believed the dead could literally rise and walk. Now I know they don't have to rise. Sometimes they just need someone to listen. My name is Diana Shadowhawk, and I've been a park ranger for 9 years. I work in the Fairweather Range, up in Alaska, where the mountains rise straight out of the ocean like giant stone teeth. Most people think being a ranger means giving tours and checking camping permits. In my world, it means pulling frozen climbers off mountain faces and talking scared hikers through blizzards over a crackling radio. I'm Tlingit, born and raised in Southeast Alaska. My grandmother used to tell stories about things that lived in the deep ice, creatures that hunted in the spaces between light and shadow. I always thought they were just stories meant to keep kids from wandering off in winter. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. November 15th, 1995. That's the date everything changed. I remember because I'd marked it on my calendar as the day the Weather Service said we might get our first break in 3 weeks of storms. Instead, we got hit with the worst blizzard in recorded history for the region. The emergency beacon went off at 2:47 inches the morning. The sound cut through the wind like a knife, waking me from the first decent sleep I'd had in days. Our small ranger station shook as another gust slammed into it, and I could hear the metal roof groaning under the weight of new snow. Mayday, Mayday, this is Climbing Expedition Alpha 7. We have injured climbers on the northeast face of Mount Krillin. Repeat, we need immediate evacuation. I grabbed the radio with numb fingers. This is Ranger Station Fairweather. Diana Shadowhawk responding. What's your current position? Static filled the air for a long moment. Then, we're trapped at 8,200 feet. 3 injured, 1 critical. The storm hit us during our descent. We can't move. I looked out the window at the wall of white. The wind was howling at 60 miles per hour, with gusts hitting 80. No helicopter could fly in this. Hell, I wasn't even sure I could make it to my truck. How many in your party total? I asked. 6. Dr. Rebecca Martinez is leading our research team. We're studying ice formations for the university. My heart sank. I knew Dr. Martinez by reputation, a respected glaciologist who'd climbed all over the world. If she was calling for help, things were really bad. I'm going to contact Search and Rescue for air support, I told them, though I already knew what they'd say. 20 minutes later, I had my answer. All flights grounded indefinitely. The storm was tracking to last another 3 days minimum. No one was getting in or out by air, which meant if those people were going to live, someone had to reach them on foot. In these conditions, that someone was me. I'd been climbing since I was 12. Started with my father on the smaller peaks around Juneau, working my way up until I was guiding tourists up Denali in the summers. After my climbing partner died in an avalanche 5 years ago, I'd thought I was done with the program's technical stuff. But sometimes the mountain doesn't give you a choice. I loaded my pack with everything I'd need for a solo rescue. Medical supplies, emergency shelter, extra food, climbing gear, rated for extreme conditions. My GPS unit showed the route to their position. 12 miles of some of the most dangerous terrain in North America. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a physical blow. The thermometer read -32 degrees, and that was before the wind chill. In this weather, exposed skin would freeze in less than 2 minutes. I started my snowmobile and began the long ride to where I'd have to start climbing. The headlight carved a weak tunnel through the blowing snow, showing me just enough of the trail to keep from driving off a cliff. 3 hours later, I reached the base of the climbing route. I killed the engine and stepped into silence, so complete it felt like being underwater. The wind had died to an eerie calm, and the snow fell straight down, in fat, lazy flakes. That should have been my first warning. In 9 years of mountain rescues, I'd never seen weather change that fast. I shouldered my pack and started up the first pitch, following the frozen waterfall that would take me to the northeast face. My ice axes bit into solid ice with reassuring chunks. My headlamp beam showed good conditions, better than I'd expected after 3 weeks of storms. 2 hours into the climb, I started finding things that didn't make sense. First, it was the tracks. Boot prints in the snow, but they were wrong somehow. Too deep for the weight they should carry, and the edges were too sharp, like they'd been cut with a knife instead of pressed into the snow. Then I found the climbing gear. A perfectly good ice axe, abandoned on a ledge. The metal was black, like it had been burned, but there was no smell of fire. When I touched it, my gloves stuck to the metal like it was covered in glue. But the thing that really got my attention was the darkness. I'd been climbing for 4 hours, and my headlamp had fresh batteries. It should have been throwing a strong white beam at least 30 feet in front of me. Instead, the light seemed to stop about 10 feet away, like it was hitting a wall. I tapped the light, thinking the lens was dirty. The beam flickered, then went back to that weird short range. I pulled out my backup flashlight and got the same result. Strong light source, but it just stopped. That's when I heard the voices. The voices were coming from above, echoing off the ice walls around me. At first, I thought it was Dr. Martinez's team calling for help, but as I climbed closer, I realized the voices weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I recognized. The sounds were wrong too. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the mountain itself was talking. And underneath the voices was something else. A sound like ice cracking, but rhythmic, almost like breathing. I keyed my radio. Climbing team, Alpha 7, this is Ranger Shadowhawk. I'm approximately 4 hours from your position. Can you hear me? Static answered me. Then faintly, Diana? Thank God. Something's wrong up here. Something's really wrong. The voice was Dr. Martinez, but she sounded terrified. In all the expedition reports I'd read about her, she'd never lost her cool. She'd been caught in avalanches, survived equipment failures at 20,000 feet, and once spent 3 days in a snow cave waiting out a storm. Nothing fazed her. What's your situation? I asked, pulling myself up another section of ice. We lost 2 people. Jim and Sarah went to set up a camp about 100 feet from our position. That was 6 hours ago. We found their tent, but... Her voice broke up in static. Dr. Martinez, say again. You found their tent? The tent was there, but they weren't. Their sleeping bags were empty, but there were no tracks leading away. No signs of struggle. It's like they just disappeared. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in my stomach. People didn't just vanish on mountains. There were always signs. Equipment scattered by wind, tracks showing which way they went, something. The mountain might kill you, but it didn't hide the evidence. I'm going to reach your position as fast as I can, I told her. Keep everyone together. Don't let anyone go off alone. There's something else, Dr. Martinez said, her voice barely audible through the static. The darkness. It's moving. Before I could ask what she meant, the radio went silent. I climbed faster, pushing myself beyond what was safe in these conditions. The ice was getting steeper, forcing me to use my technical gear. Each placement of my ice axes sent vibrations through the frozen waterfall, and I had to test every step before trusting my weight to it. That's when I saw the first body. It was hanging about 50 feet to my right, suspended from an ice screw that someone had placed in the wall. At first glance, it looked like a climber who'd fallen and gotten tangled in his rope. But as I got closer, I could see this was wrong. The man, I could tell it was a man by the size and shape, was hanging perfectly upright, like he'd been carefully positioned there. His climbing gear was still properly secured, his helmet still on his head. There was no sign of impact damage, no blood on the ice below him. But his face? I've seen people who froze to death on mountains. It's not pretty, but there's usually some expression left, some hint of the person they used to be. This man's face was completely blank, like someone had erased it. His eyes were open but completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye. No white, no color, just black holes in his head. And he was perfectly preserved. In these temperatures, a body should have shown signs of frostbite within hours. This man looked like he'd been flash frozen the moment he died. I keyed my radio again. "Dr. Martinez, I'm seeing evidence of additional casualties. Can you describe the missing team members?" No answer. Just static and that weird rhythmic crackling sound. I was about 1,000 feet below their position when I noticed my headlamp was getting dimmer. Not gradually, like a dying battery, but in sudden jumps. Every few minutes, the beam would get noticeably weaker. I stopped on a ledge and pulled out fresh batteries. As I changed them, I noticed something that made my hands shake. The old batteries weren't dead, they were frozen solid, but when I tested them with my multimeter, they still showed full charge. Something was draining the power right out of them. The new batteries worked for about 10 minutes before they started fading too. By the time I was 500 feet below the team's last known position, I was on my third set of batteries, and those were already getting weak. That's when I realized the darkness really was moving. It started as just a sense that something was wrong with the shadows around me. The way they fell didn't match where my light was pointing. Shadows that should have been cast by my body were pointing the wrong direction, and there were shadows in places where nothing should have cast them. Then I saw it directly. A patch of darkness, about the size of a person, was moving across the ice wall to my left, flowing like water but maintaining its shape. It wasn't the absence of light, it was something that ate light, swallowed it up, and left nothing behind. I pointed my headlamp directly at it. The beam hit the edge of the darkness and just stopped, like it was hitting a black hole. The thing continued moving, sliding up the ice face in a way that defied gravity. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. The Goutte Chua feeds on light and warmth. It hunts in the spaces between day and night, taking the heat from your body and the light from your eyes. I'd always thought it was just a story. The shadow thing moved closer, and I felt the temperature around me drop another 10 degrees. The ice on my breath mask started forming faster. My fingers, warm a moment before in my insulated gloves, began to sting with cold. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled out my emergency flare, struck it, and held it up like a torch. The red light blazed in the darkness, much brighter than my failing headlamp. The shadow thing stopped moving toward me and seemed to pull back, like the light was painful to it. But flares only last 15 minutes, and I had 6 of them. That wasn't nearly enough to get me back down the mountain, let alone reach the research team. I keyed my radio one more time. "Dr. Martinez, if you can hear me, I'm about 500 feet below you. Light whatever fires you can and keep them burning. There's something hunting up here, and it doesn't like bright light." Static. Then faintly, "Diana, it's here, it's in our camp. Oh God, it's..." The transmission cut off in a burst of static that sounded almost like screaming. The flare burned down to nothing in my hand, and the darkness closed in like a living thing. I immediately lit another one, the red light pushing back the shadows that seemed to breathe around me, but I could feel them testing the edges of the light, probing for weaknesses. I had to reach the research team. Whatever was up there had them, and if I didn't move fast, there wouldn't be anyone left to rescue. The climb above me was nearly vertical, a 400-foot ice wall that would normally take me 2 hours to navigate safely. I didn't have 2 hours. I didn't have the luxury of testing each placement or finding the safest route. I had to go straight up as fast as possible. I started climbing with the flare in my teeth, using both hands for my ice axes. The red light danced wildly as I moved, throwing crazy shadows across the ice. Every few minutes, I'd catch glimpses of that flowing darkness just at the edge of the light, following me up the wall like a hunting animal. Halfway up the wall, I found the second body. Dr. Sarah Chen was embedded in the ice itself, like she'd been flash frozen while climbing, and the ice had formed around her. Her eyes were the same empty black as the first victim, and her face had that terrible blank expression. But what really scared me was her position. She was frozen in the middle of a climbing move, one ice axe raised over her head, the other planted in the wall. Her rope was still properly attached, her gear in perfect order. Whatever had killed her had happened so fast, she hadn't even had time to fall. And she was warm. Even through my gloves, I could feel heat radiating from her body. In temperatures that should have frozen her solid hours ago, she was warm to the touch. Like something was keeping her body temperature up, preserving her. I tried not to think about why something would want to keep bodies fresh. The flare in my mouth was burning low. I had to keep moving. The last 100 feet were the worst. The ice was rotten, soft, and unreliable from the recent storms. Every placement of my axes sent chunks of ice raining down into the darkness below. The shadow thing was getting bolder too, testing closer and closer to the edge of my light circle. When the flare finally died, I was only 20 feet from the top. The darkness hit me like a physical weight. The temperature plummeted so fast that the moisture in my nose froze instantly. My headlamp was completely dead now, drained by whatever force was hunting me. I fumbled for another flare with numb fingers. That's when I heard the singing. It was Dr. Martinez's voice, but the tune was wrong. It wasn't any song I recognized, and the words weren't in English or Spanish. They sounded old, like the chants my grandmother used to sing during winter ceremonies. But the voice was coming from above me, and below me, and from inside the ice wall itself. I got the flare lit just as something brushed against my back. I spun around, nearly losing my grip on my ice axes. There was nothing there, but I could feel the cold spot where something had touched me. My jacket was rimed with ice in the shape of long, thin fingers. "Dr. Martinez!" I shouted. "Can you hear me?" The singing stopped. Then, in a voice that might have been hers, "Diana? We're here. We're safe now. The cold can't hurt us anymore." I pulled myself up the last few feet and rolled onto the ledge where the team had made their camp. The scene in front of me was like something from a nightmare. The research team's tents were still set up in a neat circle, exactly as they should be. Their equipment was organized and undamaged. A camp stove was still burning with a steady blue flame. But the people were wrong. All 4 surviving team members were sitting around the stove in a perfect circle. They were upright, alert, even smiling. But their eyes were solid black, and their skin had a blue-white tinge that meant severe hypothermia. And they were all singing that same wordless tune. "Dr. Martinez?" I called out, keeping the flare held high. She turned to look at me, still smiling. "Diana, you made it. Come join us. It's so warm here." I could see her breath misting in the air. The temperature around their camp was at least 40 below zero. "We need to get you all to medical attention," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're showing signs of severe hypothermia." "We're not cold," said Dr. Peterson, one of the graduate students. His lips were blue-black, and ice crystals were forming in his beard. "We haven't been cold since we stopped fighting it." That's when I noticed the additional figure in their circle. It looked like a person at first glance, the right size and shape, sitting, cross-legged like the others. But where the researchers were blue-white with cold, this figure was absolute black. Not dark clothing or shadow, but a complete absence of light in the shape of a human being. And it was looking right at me. "Join us, Diana," Dr. Martinez said. Her voice was getting fainter, like she was speaking from very far away. "It's so much easier when you stop trying to stay warm." The shadow figure stood up. It was at least 7 feet tall, and when it moved, the temperature around me dropped another 10 degrees. The flame on the camp stove guttered and dimmed. I backed toward the edge of the ledge, but I could feel more of them behind me. The darkness was full of those tall, thin shapes, surrounding the camp like they'd been waiting for me. My flare was burning low again, maybe 3 minutes of light left. "The old ways," I whispered, remembering my grandmother's words. "Fire that burns without fuel, light that comes from the spirit, not the flame." I reached into my pack and pulled out the small leather pouch my grandmother had given me when I became a ranger. Inside were 4 things: a piece of carved cedar, some dried sweetgrass, a small piece of flint, and a steel striker that had belonged to my great-grandfather. "Traditional ways don't work up here," Dr. Martinez said, but her voice was definitely fainter now. The old spirits are too small. This one is older, hungrier. The shadow figure took a step toward me, and my flare went out. In the complete darkness, I heard my grandmother's voice as clear as if she were standing next to me. The Gut Shua feeds on borrowed light, borrowed warmth, but the fire that comes from the spirit, the light that comes from the ancestors, that it cannot touch. I struck the flint against the steel in the darkness. Sparks flew, tiny points of light that seemed impossibly bright. The shadow figure stopped moving. I struck again, this time catching the sparks in the move. Bundle of sweetgrass. It caught immediately, burning with a clean white light that had nothing to do with the chemical reaction of grass and oxygen. The things surrounding me pulled back with a sound like ice breaking, but the light wouldn't last long, and I was still 12 miles from safety. The sweetgrass burned with a light that pushed back the darkness in a way my flares never could. But I could feel it using something deeper than fuel, drawing on something inside me that I couldn't afford to lose. The research team was still sitting in their circle, but they weren't singing anymore. They were just staring at me with those horrible black eyes, smiling like they knew something I didn't. "You can't carry that light all the way down," Dr. Martinez said. Her voice sounded more like her own now, like the thing controlling her was having to work harder to keep her animated. "It will burn you up from the inside." She was right. I could already feel it. The sacred fire was drawing on my life force, my body heat, my energy. I might be able to keep it lit for an hour, maybe 2 if I was lucky. But the climb down would take at least 6 hours, probably more in the dark. That's when I realized what I had to do. "My grandmother told me stories about your kind," I said, speaking to the shadow figure that loomed just beyond the edge of my light. "You're not from here. You're from the deep ice, from the places where the glaciers meet the ocean. Climate change is melting your hunting grounds." The thing didn't respond, but the air around me got colder. Ice crystals started forming on my jacket, my pack, even my eyelashes. "You're starving," I continued. "That's why you came to the mountains, looking for new territory, new sources of light and heat to feed on." The research team turned to look at the shadow figure, and for a moment, I saw confusion in their black eyes, like they were fighting against whatever was controlling them. "But, you made a mistake," I said, taking a step closer to the thing. The cold was so intense now that my breath was freezing before it left my mouth. "You chose to hunt on a mountain that belongs to the Tlingit people, a mountain where the old spirits still have power." I reached into the leather pouch again and pulled out the piece of carved cedar. It was warm in my hand, warm like it had been sitting next to a fire instead of in my pack at 40 below zero. This cedar came from a tree that grew here for 800 years. It watched over this mountain before your people ever came to the ice, and it remembers what you really are. I pressed the cedar to the burning sweetgrass, and the flame changed. Instead of the clean white light, it now burned with a golden glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once, not just from the grass in my hand, but from the ice around us, from the mountain itself. The shadow figure let out a sound like wind through ice caves, and the research team collapsed like puppets with their strings cut. But the thing wasn't defeated, it was angry. The darkness around us began to move, flowing like black water up the sides of the mountain. The temperature plummeted so fast that the metal on my climbing gear became dangerous to touch. Ice formed on every surface, including my clothes and skin. I realized the shadow figure wasn't just hunting for food anymore. This was about territory, about dominance. It saw me as a threat to its claim on this mountain. The golden light from the cedar was holding it back, but barely. And I could feel the energy cost burning through me like fire. My hands were shaking, my vision was starting to blur, and I was having trouble focusing my thoughts. I looked down at the research team. They were unconscious, but breathing. Their eyes back to normal. Whatever the thing had done to them was breaking down as its attention focused on me. That gave me an idea. "You want to fight for this mountain?" I said to the shadow figure. "Then let's do this right, traditional way. Single combat on the summit." The thing paused. In the deep ice, challenges like this would be recognized, respected. It was part of the old laws that governed spirits and monsters. "If you win, the mountain is yours," I continued. "But if I win, you go back to the deep ice and stay there." The shadow figure nodded once, slowly. Then it began to move up the mountain, flowing over the ice like smoke. The challenge was accepted. I looked at the unconscious research team. They'd be safe here for a few hours. The thing's attention was entirely on me now. But if I lost this fight, they'd die anyway when the cold took them. I had to reach the summit, and I had to get there before the sacred fire burned me up from the inside. The final 1,000 feet to the summit of Mount Krillon were the hardest climbing I'd ever done. The golden light from the cedar allowed me to see, but it also attracted every ounce of the shadow figure's hatred. The thing followed me up the mountain face like a black storm cloud, and everywhere it passed, the ice became so cold it was dangerous to touch. My climbing gear was covered in frost thick enough to affect its function. My rope was stiff as wire. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But the sacred fire kept burning, and the golden light kept the darkness at bay. 3 hours later, I pulled myself onto the summit plateau. The top of Mount Krillon is a flat area about the size of a football field, covered in wind-packed snow that never melts even in summer. The shadow figure was waiting for me. Up here, with nothing to block the wind and no shelter from the cold, it looked even larger. At least 9 feet tall, and its darkness was so complete it seemed to bend space around itself. When it moved, reality rippled like water. "Last chance to submit," it said, speaking in a voice like ice breaking. "Join your nature, kind to mine. Feed the hunger that gives life meaning." I held up the burning cedar. The golden light blazed brighter, but I could feel it drawing more and more from my life force. My legs were shaking with exhaustion, and my thoughts were getting fuzzy from the energy drain. "I've got a better idea," I said. "How about you go hungry?" The shadow figure lunged at me with impossible speed. I dove to the side, rolling across the snow as the thing's touch turned the air where I'd been standing into a cloud of ice crystals. I came up running, keeping the sacred fire between me and the creature. But I couldn't run forever. The summit plateau was only so big, and the thing was faster than me. Eventually, it would corner me. That's when I remembered the last part of my grandmother's instructions. The fire that burns without fuel can become the light that burns without limit. But the price is everything you are. I understood now. The cedar, the sweetgrass, the sacred fire, they weren't weapons, they were keys. Keys to unlock something much older and more powerful than the shadow figure. I stopped running and turned to face the thing as it rushed toward me. Then I pressed both hands to the burning cedar and opened myself completely to the sacred fire. The golden light exploded outward from my hands like a star being born. The light that erupted from the sacred cedar wasn't just bright, it was everything light could be. It was the warmth of summer sunshine, the comfort of a fireplace, the safety of dawn after a long night. It was every good thing that light had ever meant to anyone. The shadow figure stopped in its tracks, then began to shrink away from me. But this wasn't retreat. This was something much more fundamental. The sacred light was unmaking it, sending it back to whatever deep, cold place it had come from. "This mountain belongs to the people who have cared for it for thousands of years," I said, my voice carrying across the summit with unnatural clarity, "and we will not let you turn it into a hunting ground." The thing let out one final sound, part wind, part breaking ice, part something that might have been acknowledgement. Then it collapsed in on itself and was gone, leaving only a dark patch in the snow that quickly faded to white. The sacred fire went out, and I collapsed. I don't remember much of the trip down. The rescue helicopter found me 12 hours later, unconscious in a snow cave about halfway down the mountain. According to the pilot, I'd somehow managed to carry all 4 members of the research team to safety, one at a time, though I have no memory of doing it. Dr. Martinez and her team recovered completely. They remembered camping on the mountain and then waking up in the hospital. Everything in between was a blank. The official report listed them as victims of severe hypothermia and altitude sickness. 2 bodies were recovered from the mountain. Jim and Sarah, the graduate students who'd gone missing first. The coroner said they died of exposure, though he couldn't explain some of the unusual findings. Their families chose to have them cremated rather than ask too many questions. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, mostly for exhaustion and frostbite. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with me that rest and warm food wouldn't fix, but I knew something had changed. I can't handle darkness anymore, not complete darkness. If I'm in a room and all the lights go out, I start shaking. I sleep with 3 different light sources running, and I always carry at least 4 flashlights when I work. My grandmother says it's the price of channeling sacred fire. You borrowed from the light itself, she told me during one of her visits to the hospital. Now you must always stay close to it, or risk losing yourself to the shadows you fought. I transferred to a different park the following spring, somewhere warmer, with longer days and shorter nights. I still work as a ranger, but now I also teach traditional survival methods to other Park Service employees. How to read weather signs the old way. How to find water when your equipment fails. How to make fire from practically nothing. Most importantly, I teach them about respect. Respect for the land, for the old ways, for the things that were here long before we were and will probably be here long after we're gone. Sometimes, late at night when I'm sure no one is listening, I tell them about the other things that might be out there. The things that climate change is pushing into new territory, looking for new hunting grounds. I tell them about the signs to watch for and what to do if they ever encounter something that shouldn't exist. Most of them think I'm just telling campfire stories, but a few pay attention. They ask questions about the old ways, about traditional knowledge, about how our ancestors survived things that would kill us today. Those are the ones I worry about least. The others, well, the world is changing fast. The ice is melting, the weather patterns are shifting, and things that have been sleeping in the deep cold for thousands of years are starting to wake up. I still carry the piece of cedar my grandmother gave me. It's just a piece of carved wood now. No special warmth, no sacred fire. But sometimes, when the nights are longest and the darkness presses close, I think I can feel it waiting, ready to burn again if I need it to. I hope I never do. But if something else comes hunting on my mountains, something else that thinks human beings are just another source of food and warmth, it's going to learn the same lesson the Shadow Eater did. This land belongs to the people who understand it, and we remember how to fight back. The hunger that devours light is always out there somewhere, waiting in the spaces between day and night. But the fire that burns without fuel is waiting too, and the fire has been here longer.